Hi, I'm Dave. I'm on the steering committee or board of Wisconsin Environmental Health Network. We've been meeting, I guess, as a board, and this started 15 years ago in 2011, which seems like it's flown by, and putting on these wonderful conferences. Could I have all the steering committee members stand up or raise their hands? They'll all introduce themselves as we go. So I'm a family. Thank you. I'm a family medicine physician with UW Health, doing urgent care currently, so I have more time for all of the other activities that I do like this. And I also wanted to make sure that we thanked, besides thanking all of you and the folks online, I wanted to make sure we thank Marta Karlov, our executive director, who put all this together for us. She's a gem. We're really happy to have her. And just some housekeeping. We have a water cooler back there, but all the other food and everything is going to be in the other room. So when we take a break, we're going to go over there. There is compost. Okay, so if you have anything, you know, like probably just your oranges or something, you can put it in there. Okay, we try to have as least waste as possible. We tried to demonstrate that you can have conference and not have a lot of waste. So I also want to remind you to make sure to do your evaluations at the end. If you haven't picked them up, pick one up. Also, I wanted to thank our sponsors that are all tabling today, and please make your rounds through them. If you're here wanting continuing medical education, there is a QR code to scan. It's in the other room, just so you know where that is. Okay. And we'll remind you of that later as well. I also wanted to introduce our artist, Catherine Capillero, who's sitting back there. Every year we feature an artist whose art's inspired by and bringing attention to the human impact on the world in terms of our environment. And so this year we're featuring Catherine Capralero's art, Jamaica After Melissa, Images of Resilience. And in October of last year, Hurricane Melissa was the third Category 5 hurricane in the Atlantic hurricane season and the first ever to hit Jamaica. And it ripped through that island, moving on to cause further damage to Cuba and Bermuda. Melissa's power has been well documented, and the storm has been tied to a 1935 Labor Day hurricane as the strongest storm to make landfall. And so we thought it was fitting in the age of, climate change, and that we feature her art of the resilience of the people of Jamaica. So it not only illustrates, the devastation, in terms of, where we think, what's been, hit in the world, but also the resilience and the hope. And so I invite you to look through the gallery at the paintings and just think about that, we have resilience. There always has to be hope through this storm. Okay. I'm going to introduce just briefly Beth Neary to come to she's a co-president with me of WEHN, and she's going to introduce our first speaker. What the slides. Oh, here's the conference sponsors. Yeah, I forgot all the slides completely.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Bruce Lanphear, and I forgot my notes. So Dr. Lanphear is a preventive medicine physician and a professor at Simon Fraser University, British Columbia, Canada. He received his MPH from Tulane University and his MD from University of Missouri. He is an expert on children's environmental health. He's dedicated his career to research on an array of toxins. With regard to his research, he has spent many, many years, over 30 years, doing research on sources of lead exposure and health impact of lead poisoning. In fact, his research was so significant that the CDC decided in 2012 that there's no safe level of lead in the blood. He served on the science advisory committees of the EPA, the CDC, the National Toxicology Program, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. I will do one ad for him. He does a blog on Substack, which is called Plagues, Pollution, and Poverty, and he posts every Tuesday, and it's really worth your time. So we welcome Bruce back to Wisconsin. He was here 8 years ago, and we have him back again. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, and it's always an honor to come back. So I wanted to talk about collateral damage, the impact of toxic chemicals and pollution on human health. And I wanted to do it in the context of stories. For many years, as a scientist, I believe that's how you change things. You do the science. And that, of course, is important. We need the science, but it's absolutely almost never enough by itself. Everything is held together with stories. That's all that's holding us together, stories and compassion. So how do we decide what kind of research to fund? It's not science, that's stories. We tell stories about what's important, and that's what drives what we fund and what we act on once we have evidence. So I've been trying over the past 15 years or so to try to take the science and find ways to make it more accessible. Here's one story. Decoding the human genome is the best hope we have for preventing suffering and curing terrible disease. You buy it? I didn't 15 years ago. It's important. Genetics is absolutely important. Every condition I'll talk about today is a consequence of genes and environment operating together. It's not one or the other, but we have put so much emphasis on decoding the human genome as though that is going to prevent and cure terrible diseases. Now, if we look at the actual causes of death, and this is always challenging, right? And I'll talk about this. I know I'll fall into it. Coronary heart disease is the leading cause of death. Well, it's not really. It's the upstream factors, air pollution, lead, cholesterol, right? Hypertension. Those are what cause coronary heart disease, but we all simplify it and talk about coronary heart disease as leading cause of death. But if we begin to look at the upstream risk factors, 3/4 of the things that kill us, this is around the globe, can be attributed to unhealthy diets, tobacco, lead poisoning, air pollution, indoor and outdoor, sedentary, unsafe water and sanitation, secondhand smoke, and on and on. And there's other drivers. You'll hear more about climate change as a driver. We're not going to solve these problems by decoding the human genome. Let me give you an example. Now, up until very recently, I studied mostly children. And yet I knew that we were missing out, that there was good evidence that lead was a risk factor for dying from coronary heart disease or heart attacks. And even if I didn't know, Ellen Silbergeld, who's one of the brilliant toxicologists and a very mercurial toxicologist, one day she is your best friend, the next day she might lash out at you, and watch out. In the end, she was your best friend, but she was also very critical. And for years, she would tell me, when are you going to start studying adults? And I felt like, I'm barely able to function by just focusing on kids. And then I was invited to serve on this panel in 2012 in the National Toxicology Program, the health effects of low-level lead. And our job was to look at the evidence and to determine if there were health effects in children and adults at blood lead levels below 10 microgram per deciliter or 100 parts per billion of lead in blood. And we identified a number of things that we said there was enough causal evidence But we didn't draw that conclusion about lead and coronary heart disease in 2012. But when I looked at the evidence, I said, well, it looks to me like we have more than adequate evidence. But there's a very outspoken cardiovascular epidemiologist who's, no, no, no. Yes, it causes hypertension, but it doesn't cause coronary heart disease. Well, the next year, the EPA Science Advisory Board drew that conclusion. And yet still, nothing happens, right? Coronary heart disease, leading cause of death in the United States, Canada, the world. It appeared that lead was a strong risk factor, but it was almost on nobody's familiar litany of risk factors, right? It's all about behaviors, smoking, bad diet, not enough exercise, bad genes, right? It's all your fault. It has nothing to do with anything in the environment. Now, that's, of course, begun to change with research on air pollution, but even with all these signals, and you'll see more about the history of lead and arteriosclerosis. And so I was really perplexed and a little bit troubled by this, that lead appeared to be a really strong risk factor, and we weren't really taking it seriously. So eventually, I did do a study, and what we found using the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey was that lead was the leading risk factor for dying from coronary heart disease in the United States. More than smoking, more than obesity. Hard to believe, isn't it? Now, let me give you an example of why it might be a stronger contributor than smoking. If you look at smokers, the risk is comparable to lead. A smoker is almost twofold more likely to develop coronary heart disease and die. For lead, an increase from the 10th to the 90th percentile is associated with about a twofold increased risk. So how can lead contribute more than smoking? Because only 20% of people smoke. Everybody's exposed to lead. So we published this and it got a little scholarly attention, but not much. And so I kept trying to find ways, how do we begin to change this story, the narrative that we operate out of? And so I want to share with you a video that we put together in celebration, I think that's the wrong word, in recognition of the 100th anniversary of adding lead to gasoline. Perhaps one of the worst decisions that was ever made. Shocked by coming to see the bill. We're talking tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for surgery, hospital stays, and life-saving drugs. Bypass surgery, that's a six-figure price tag. Even basic prescriptions to keep your heart ticking can cost more than rent. We hear it all the time. Eat healthy, exercise, don't smoke. And sure, those things matter. But what if I told you, despite everything we've been taught, heart disease isn't just about personal choice? What if one of the keys driving the coronary heart disease epidemic has been hiding in plain sight? This is about one of the biggest public health disasters of the 20th century, and a striking decline in fatal heart attacks that began more than 50 years ago and has remained unsolved until now. But wait, aren't heart attacks inevitable? Aren't they part of growing old? Let's rewind. Until the 1900s, heart attacks were rare, but by the 1930s, heart attacks were the leading cause of death in the United States, and not because people were living longer. Deaths from heart attacks continued to increase, and by the 1960s, they accounted for nearly 1/3 of all deaths. But then, in 1968, a seismic shift occurred. Deaths from heart attacks, which had been climbing for years, dropped by 20%. In the fall of 1978, leading doctors and scientists from across the United States gathered at the National Institute of Health to determine if the decline was real and what caused it. They concluded that the drop in heart attack was too steep, too widespread, and too sustained to be a fluke. The decline was real, they said, and it affected everybody. 190,000 more people were alive than expected. But here's where it gets complicated. While experts knew about some risk factors for heart attack,
They couldn't explain why the numbers were dropping so fast. The truth was, they had too many possible explanations, and none of them seemed to fit all the data. But here's the kicker: the drop in heart attacks come back to everybody, and it was happening everywhere. Something bigger was going on. It must be something in the environment. Was it fewer people smoking, better medical care, diet, exercise? This is where things really interesting. Thanks to growing public health awareness and lawsuits, the United States began phasing out leaded gasoline. The Clean Air Act, passed in 1970, was a game changer. Over the next 2 decades, the production of leaded gasoline plummeted, and with it, lead and air. As the use of leaded gasoline dropped, so did the amount of lead found in the blood of Americans. This toxic metal, which had been silently poisoning millions, was suddenly disappearing from the street, and with it, death from heart attack. It doesn't get much clearer than this. But if you need more proof, we can look at Britain. While the United States saw a drop in heart attack in the 1970s, Britain didn't, even though air pollution had declined. When Britain did begin to reduce production of leaded gasoline in the mid-1980s, however, heart attacks declined just as they had in the United States. But wait, it wasn't only heart attacks that declined. Hypertension or high blood pressure plummeted in the United States from 35% to 20%. That's a huge drop. That alone would have reduced the number of Americans on blood pressure meds by half. Scientists couldn't explain the decline with the usual factors, smoking, medication, obesity, but hypertension among Americans dropped and lockstep with blood level. 1985, Dr. Jim Perkins predicted that the phase out of leaded gasoline would cause a substantial reduction in hypertension and heart attack. Still, the idea that lead poisoning was behind the decline never gained the attention it deserved. For decades, regulatory agencies operated under the assumption that small amounts of lead were safe. This assumption wasn't an accident. In 1921, the chemist at General Motors discovered that adding lead to gasoline improved fuel efficiency. Leaded gasoline production took off. Then in 1924, 80% of workers manufacturing tetraethyl lead at Standard Oil in New Jersey had severe lead poisoning. 5. Sales of leaded gasoline were promptly banned in New Jersey, Philadelphia, and New York City. The U.S. Surgeon General convened an expert panel to determine whether it was safe to add tetraethyl lead to gasoline. The nation's leading chemical warfare expert warned the use of tetraethyl lead will cause vast numbers of the population to suffer slow lead poisoning with hardening the heart. But his warning was dismissed. Instead, Robert Kehoe, the chief medical officer of the Ethical Corporation, successfully argued that until tetraethyl lead from automobile emissions was proven to be toxic, government agencies should not prohibit it. You guessed it. And with the rights of industry over the health of Americans. What's more, the Kehoe rule set a century-long precedent, allowing industries to use poisonous chemicals until scientists repeatedly proved they were toxic. Heart attacks have declined by an astonishing 70% since 1968. But they are still the leading cause of death in the United States. And yet, the devastation caused by lead poisoning is rarely talked about, despite compelling evidence. It's still easier to blame people for their lifestyle choices than it is to regulate industry. Lead poisoning isn't only an American problem. We're in the midst of a worldwide epidemic. As affluent countries ban lead, gas, and other consumer products, the lead industry shifted its market for industrializing countries like India, China. Over the past 3 decades, heart attacks climbed upwards in industrialized countries. In 2023, the World Bank estimated that lead killed 5.5 million people around the world every year at a cost of $4.6 trillion. It turns out the biggest public health breakthroughs aren't about miracle drugs or cutting edge technology. They're about stopping the problem at the source. Lead was never necessary, never safe. But thanks to the Kehoe rule, industry got a free path to poison failure, and we keep making the same mistake. Instead of cleaning up the damage, we should prevent it. That means getting federal agencies, power, keep toxic chemicals out of the air, through water, in our home. Because history proves one thing. If we don't stop, no one will.
So the keyhole rule is still in effect. That's why we have problems with PFAS, pesticides that are known to be toxic. That what happens when you have a chemical that gets approved, even if it's approved because they did one rat study involving 50 people. Now it has a golden seal of approval. And getting that golden seal of approval takes hundreds of studies in humans, hundreds of studies in laboratories. That's the keyhole rule. And that's how we are protecting American citizens. Lead, of course, is not the only risk factor. In addition to some of those lifestyle choices, which are real, air pollution and cigarette smoke are also major risk factors. This was a study that Arden Pope did where he could show the same pattern, really. This is called a decelerating exposure response relationship, where you see a steep increase in risk and then a plateau in risk at higher levels. Or in other words, there is no safe level. We saw the same pattern with lead and coronary heart disease deaths, same steep increased risk, no evidence of any safe level or threshold. Smoking, another risk factor. And it's hard to imagine that low levels of toxic chemicals, whether it's lead or smoking, can be that big of a deal. But this was a study, and this has been replicated in other countries as well. This was a study in Scotland where they found the ban on smoking in public places led to a 20% reduction in heart attacks among non-smoking adults. Non-smoking adults. I'm talking about heart disease, but they also found a 15% reduction in preterm birth following the ban in non-smoking pregnant women. Very low concentrations can have a big impact. So heavy metals and air pollution, or it could be heavy metals in air pollution, I believe were the mysterious culprits of the rise and the decline in coronary heart disease. Now, clearly, I say decline, there's still a lot more to do. And we'll talk in just a minute, maybe about some of the puzzles that we can begin to understand if we look at conditions like heart disease or Parkinson's with an environmental lens. So this is the study I mentioned in the video. The World Bank estimated that every year about 5.5 million people around the world died from lead-induced coronary heart disease, or cardiovascular disease more broadly, excuse me. But 30%, they estimated that 30% of all cardiovascular disease was from lead exposure, about 20% from air pollution, and another 20% from smoking. So that adds up to a big part of the overall burden of disease from coronary heart disease. In addition to IQ deficits, they estimated about 765 billion IQ points lost in children every year, mostly in low to middle income countries, because as we restricted the use of lead in gasoline and other consumer products, the industry promptly sold it to industrializing countries. Collectively, those add up to about $6 trillion in cost every year, about 5.3% of global GDP, and almost 8% in low to middle income countries. So a huge burden. We don't need genetics to solve this problem. Now, I mentioned I'd like to sort of use this as an example. What could we achieve if instead of using a predominantly genetic lens, we used an environmental lens to understand disease? Why is acidic water, like what happened in Flint, Michigan, a risk factor for heart disease? This has been a dilemma that engineers have wondered about for years. Well, the acidic water leaches lead from pipes and increases your exposures to lead. what initiates atherosclerosis? Does anybody know what the initial lesion of atherosclerosis is called? Endothelial dysfunction. And the name itself will tell you, we have no idea what starts it. Endothelial dysfunction, thickening of the single cell lining of the arteries, thickening and tears. And then something gets underneath it. White cells and lipids and foamy macrophages that are trying to ingest some foreign bodies. This was a study by a master's student in South Africa in 2023. And it was like much research, it was kind of serendipitous. The supervisor of Leanne van Strip had a grant that said that she would make sure all of her students studied heavy metals. And then somebody else in the department had a license to look at endothelial cells in laboratory tissue culture. And so what Leanne did is to add very small concentrations of lead and cadmium to these tissue cultures. And what she found at levels, this is levels in typical American a couple of years ago, 8.5 microgram per liter. Beginning at levels of 0.14 microgram per liter, she could see differences between the control in blebs and in tears in those endothelial cells. So why do I think that might give us some indication of the cause of atherosclerosis? Think about it like a pita pocket, right? You get a tear in that endothelial lining, and then you get the blood flowing, and it's going to force stuff under the endothelial cell. And then you're going to get macrophages. And in a study looking at concentrations of lead in Britons from the 1970s, they found that the atheroma, that early plaque, was where in soft tissue, the highest concentrations of lead were found. Ultimately, that's going to form a plaque, and it's going to narrow the arteries. And then when it bursts, when you get plaque rupture, which almost sounds spiritual, doesn't it? Plaque rupture. That's when you obstruct the coronary arteries. And with all that gradus flowing into the lumen of the arteries, it will form a clot. And if it blocks all of the flow, then of course you'll have a heart attack. And if it's a big enough blockage, you'll die. So using an environmental lens gives us some insight into something like endothelial dysfunction. It also, I think, helps us understand why women during their reproductive years are protected against coronary heart disease. Up until menarche, puberty in girls, blood levels in boys and girls are about the same. And then with menarche, girls' blood levels drop by about 20%. Why? The estrogen increases bone formation. Most of our lead is stored in our bones. And so it's taking it out of the system. Every month with menstruation, girls will lose a little bit of blood. And because estrogen is at its lowest at that time, blood levels for that month will be at their highest. So they're losing a little bit every month. On top of that, when you give birth, you're offloading lead. You're supposed to be giving your kid calcium, but you're also offloading lead from your bones to your developing baby. So women's blood level stays 20% lower. This is probably includes to some extent occupational exposures, but it absolutely also includes the role of estrogen throughout the reproductive years. And then something happens. And now we're back to Ellen Silbergeld again. Ellen Silbergeld found that around menopause, women's blood levels spike upwards by about 30% on average. But the spike is higher for women that had fewer babies or no babies. Women with 3 or more babies had a lower spike because they'd already gotten rid of some of their lead with their pregnancies. And then after menopause, the risk of coronary heart disease is comparable or even a little catch up with women. Now, I can also tell you that we probably might be looking for other things. I mentioned this last night, I think, kind of in preparation for today. My wife, who's a developmental pediatrician, is almost close to a photographic memory. And as I said last night, I almost never win an argument. After menopause, though, her retrieval seemed to change. And we know that lead may play a role in accelerated cognitive decline. So it may not only be coronary heart disease, and we may begin to understand better dementia, heart disease, and many other conditions when we start to look at it more carefully with an environmental lens. All right, I want to talk a little bit about children now. And around the year 2000, Environmental Working Group published a paper. And it was quite revolutionary in that they measured over 200 chemicals in 10 children, only in 10 children. It's not a big sample, but it began to change the way we think about things. Up until that time, we were mostly studying one chemical at a time. Herb Needleman did a study of lead exposure. The Jacobsons, they did a study of PCBs. Others, mercury. That was, we could call those the first generation studies. And then the second generation studies with like Ricky Pereira was sort of one of the leaders in this, beginning to measure dozens of chemicals. Because if you're going to bother to recruit hundreds of children and take their blood or their urine, you might as well take advantage of it and be efficient. And so the second generation of studies started to look at all of these different chemicals. I helped found one in Cincinnati that has measured hundreds of chemicals. And just as a quick example, we found, surprisingly, that the women in Cincinnati had levels of PFOA twice as high as the national average. Initially, we weren't sure why. They weren't workers. They were just drinking tap water from the Ohio River. And the DuPont factory, the Washington Works, 200 miles upriver, were dumping their C8, their PFOA, into the water, and our moms were drinking it. Now, of course, we all know every one of us is exposed, thanks to the keyhole rule. And of course, we are all a toxic soup. And I wanted to talk about the implications of that a little bit. This was a review article that Philippe Grandjean and Phil Landrigan published in 2006. And they were just trying to give a sense of the scope. It was about, at the time, 5 chemicals that were known to be toxic to human neurodevelopment, about 200 known to be neurotoxic in human beings more generally, about 1,000 known to be neurotoxic in experiments, and at the time, they estimated the chemical universe to be about 80,000 chemicals overall. More recent estimates are about 340,000. And this is easily at least 1 or 2 dozen by now that are known to be neurotoxic, depending upon how definitive you want the evidence to be. And yet we keep doing it to ourselves. We keep arguing that until we have shown definitively that this chemical or that chemical is toxic, we have no right to prohibit industry from using those chemicals. In 2005, a new concept was introduced, the exposome. Christopher Wilde introduced this idea that to match the genome, we needed something to match the entire universe of exposures. And so he came up with this idea of the exposome. And it took a few years to get off the ground, and now it's really picking up speed. Trying to figure out how to take full advantage of this is really challenging. I mean, we can measure thousands of chemicals in cord blood. It's expensive, but we can do it. We can begin to measure epigenetics. And while this is extraordinarily powerful, and I'm a big supporter of doing this and figuring out how to do it better, we also have to recognize that just like decoding the human genome, perhaps provided some clarification of a few conditions, it actually complicates things just as much as it simplifies them, perhaps even more. And we need to be very thoughtful that we don't think the exposome is going to come along, and we don't have to wait for evidence from the exposome, right, to come all together. It's still uh, fascinating, it's still important, but we know enough to act in a lot of ways already. And I'll give you an example with something that's become extraordinarily controversial, excuse me. Just as an aside, in 2012, I think it was, I received the Sterling Prize in Controversy. South African gave it to me, controversy, which I thought was pretty cool. Halfway through the nomination process, I found out from my friend who studies tobacco, Jim Sargent at Dartmouth, that Ted Sterling, who had given the money for this, had received a lot of money from the tobacco industry. And I said, well, geez, what am I going to do? And so I thought hard about it, and I said, should I just turn it down if I was awarded it? And I was ultimately given the award, and I decided to accept the award, but give away the prize. There was a $5,000 prize because I didn't feel like I could take that. One of the things I realized in preparing for that talk is that often when we think of controversy or controversy, our tendency is to say, run like hell, right? I'm not going to touch that. We talked about fluoride last night. Run like hell. What it really means is that that's an indication is something we should be talking about. So, in addition to fluoride, let's just open the door on autism. Has autism increased? If you think of what the New York Times is telling us, people like Holden Thorpe, the editor-in-chief of Science, it's all just diagnostic shift. It's mostly genetic. A couple of examples. This was from last year. Decades of scientific research point most compellingly to genetic mutations affecting brain development as a primary driver of autism. Researchers have already identified hundreds of mutations linked to the disorder. And while most scientists say genetics likely interacts in some ways with environmental factors, research has disproved some of the most widespread notions and has produced weak or conflicting evidence for others. I mean, just look at the choice of words. The environmental research are just notions. The mutations are primary drivers. The best geneticists have come up with is 15%, maybe 30%. Now, there are at least two big groups of autism we should think about. There are some where families are enriched. A family that has a child with autism that has another child. Other ones where they're not enriched. We've done about 5 different collaborative studies pooling together enriched and non-enriched studies, and the risk factors are almost always different. So I think we're at least talking about 2 different broad categories, and even that's probably simplifying things. But what I really wanted to point out with this slide and the next one is some of the language we use. Dismissing environmental triggers altogether, really, they're just notions. Holden Thorpe, could there be other factors behind the surge in autism diagnoses beyond increased awareness? Yes. Conservative estimates, these are just conservative, it's probably more than this, account that genetic factors may account for about 80% of autism risk. 80%. That leaves room for environmental factors. For instance, there are studies suggesting a link between autism and exposures of mothers exposed to nitric oxide found in air pollution. This 80% is based on heritability studies, twin studies. I want to share with you some results of a heritability study, a twin study, and obesity to show you it's not so much the problem with twin studies and heritability. It's how we interpret them, right? So Holden Thorpe said that these studies indicate genetic factors account for about 80% of autism risk. It's based on the heritability. Let's look at two different groups. These are also twin studies, but this study is amazing because what they did is they didn't stop looking at twins. They said, what happens if those twins grow up in different environments? And so in the lower risk homes where healthier foods were available and children had more opportunities to be active, the heritability of BMI or obesity was modest, about 40%. Shared environmental factors explain much of the remaining variation. In high-risk obesogenic homes, heritability soared to nearly 90%. The contribution of shared environment nearly disappeared. So based on how we interpret these heritability studies, genetics explains a lot more in these high-risk obesogenic homes. And that actually makes perfect sense. It's the environment that brings out the genetic susceptibility. If you get a signal that says these heritability studies say that a lot of this is genetic, absolutely. But it's because of the environment that people are growing up in. Does that make sense? And we are, some of the brightest among us, completely missing out on that and attributing it to genetics. An example. This is looking at plastic chemicals, bisphenol A in particular. And this was a study that was published in 2024. And Christoph was interested. Christoph is a pediatrician, a developmental pediatrician in Australia working with the Mindrew Foundation. And there was some evidence that bisphenol A alters the aromatase enzyme, which converts testosterone to estrogen. And there was some evidence that it increased traits consistent with autism. So here's bisphenol A. And we've known for a long time that it binds to estrogen receptors. And estrogen, particularly in boys, can be really important. Some boys have weak enzymes, aromatase enzymes. And if they're not producing enough estrogen, it impacts their ability to grow brain cells, synapses, and in rodents, they found that it increases traits that are consistent with what we call autisms in humans. So in the Barwin study, which is an Australian cohort study, they specifically looked at BPA exposure in boys who produced low amounts of this enzyme, aromatase. And they found that it was a combination where they saw the strongest signal. And there's a lot of other studies looking at similar kinds of findings with other chemicals. They took, and I'll come back to that in just a minute, they took it to the next level. In the same study, they looked at mice. And they knocked out the gene for the aromatase enzyme and found that those mice exhibited symptoms comparable with autism. Or they dosed mice with bisphenol A and found that it mimicked the same kinds of symptoms. We have a number of things like this with autism. You already heard that Holden Thorpe mentioned air pollution, and there's a number of studies. The threshold that we have for saying something's definitive is quite high, but the evidence is very compelling for air pollution. We have evidence for pesticides, whether it's glyphosate and pregnant women living near agricultural fields with spray drift or chlorpyrifos. These pesticides are doing something. Now, I mentioned with aromatase, other chemicals can damage aromatase. Phthalates tend to reduce the amounts of aromatase. So even if bisphenol A is what they studied, other chemicals can play a role. Bisphenol A damages brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is also critical for brain development. So does lead. So I was trying to think of an analogy about how do we begin to help people think about behaviors like autism. Think of a sound mixer. Each of these could be a gene. Each of those knobs could be a gene. And the genes clearly are going to play a role. They are a susceptibility factor. And the environment comes along and determines how much they're going to be turned on or turned off. Are they loud or soft? So if we go back to that cocktail of chemicals that we're all exposed to, we can begin to understand the idea of neurodivergence. We can understand how some clinicians will talk about autism as every child with autism is different, just as every one of us is different, because we all had a different fingerprint of exposures, didn't we? Not only do we have different genes, but we have all these different environmental triggers altering those genes to varying degrees. And in some cases, those chemicals operate together enough to push us over some threshold so that children meet the threshold for ADHD or autism. A couple quick examples. Some of these are older, but they work. This was from a national survey we did looking at lead and ADHD. And we're looking here at, in the blue curve, children in the 33% lowest blood lead levels compared to the 33 percentile above in the highest levels. So the lowest third and the highest third. And overall, the difference in the mean number of symptoms isn't that great. The mean number of symptoms in the low lead group is about 1, and in the high lead group, it's about 3. Now, a typical child who meets criteria for autism will have about 15 symptoms consistent with autism, right? So that doesn't just make you jump up and go, oh, wow, that's really bad, right? But look at what happens at the tail. That shift from the lowest third to the top third of lead exposure increases the percent of kids who meet criteria for ADHD from 5% to 13%, over twofold increased risk. But wait, there's more. This is looking at children who were in the lowest third of blood lead levels and who were not exposed to tobacco in utero, compared to kids with the highest third who were exposed to tobacco in utero. Now we can see that the mean number of symptoms increases from 1 to 6 across those two groups. And the children who had both exposures, 1 out of 4 met criteria for ADHD. Now that's just 2 chemicals. There are a lot of different chemicals that we know are dopaminergic toxicants that seem to preferentially affect the prefrontal cortex. That's where ADHD appears to primarily arise from. So whether it's air pollution, that increases the risk of ADHD. And so now we've got this cocktail of toxic chemicals that our kids are exposed to. Well, we all are, but it's particularly important because our kids are going through rapid brain development, right? One of the examples I use when I talk to my students about rapid brain development is that think about chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is basically for people who have a cancer, we're going to give them a poison, right? And the goal is for that poison to get taken up by the fast-growing cells, the cancer cells. But what if the fast-growing cells are the brain cells of normal developing children? There's other reasons that children are more vulnerable. That's one of the big ones. The brain grows over a much longer time period. Some other examples of how toxic chemicals can work together, or toxic chemicals and nutrients. This is an example from Bristol, England. Carolyn Taylor found that pregnant women with blood lead levels over 50 parts per billion, 5 microgram per deciliter, were almost 2 times more likely to give birth preterm. From our Canadian cohort, the MIREX study, we found that a 10 part per billion increase, so that's 1 microgram per deciliter. Most people still think of that as low, small, innocuous, inconsequential. A 10 part per billion increase in pregnant women in the MIREC cohort was associated with a 50% increase in premature birth. Among women who had low vitamin D levels, and a 10 part per billion increase was associated with almost a 2.5-fold increased risk of preterm birth. So what do we do when we have an increase in preterm birth in the United States? Build more NICUs. We aren't going upstream to look at the risk factors, not these kinds of risk factors, because these notions, we've been told, don't add up. There's a number of risk factors, a number of chemicals that increase the risk of premature birth. PFAS, another great example. There's other ways that this is operated. Most of us look at this epidemic of lung cancer, and we'd say that increase in cigarette smoking led to this increase in death. Now, of course, that's both heart disease and lung cancer, among other things, but this particular graph is looking at lung cancer. And I think most of us, if asked, we'd quickly say smoking, right? And smoking is the chief culprit, but it's not the only one. Lead arsenate used to be used as an insecticide in the 1930s and 40s and even into the 50s. And arsenic increases the risk of lung cancer, and it magnifies the increase of smoking. It has a synergistic effect. In addition, of course, there's radon and asbestos, and those are also synergistic. So this wasn't just an epidemic of lung cancer from smoking. It also was an epidemic because of arsenic and radon, asbestos, and smoking. And it might even offer us clues. Now we're beginning to see more people with lung cancer who didn't smoke. Well, where should we even begin? How about arsenic and asbestos and radon? Now, radon we already know about, and some of these others we do, but this would be sort of a natural question if we were paying attention. So the science is clear, and I just gave you a couple of examples. A lot of you now are beginning to hear more and more about Parkinson's and paraquat, and Parkinson's and living near golf courses, and Parkinson's and TCE from dry cleaners. I was fortunate. I went down to Palm Beach to visit these 5 ladies that calls themselves the Songbirds. And they invited Ray Dorsey and me because they wanted us to talk about pesticides in children's health. And Ray talked about pesticides and Parkinson's disease. And they call themselves the Songbirds because they don't have any in Palm Beach. They're gone. And we stayed in the guest house of one of these families that own, $30 million houses. And I was out in the yard and they don't have insects either. And they know what's going on. It's pesticides. And they can't stop the state they can't ban pesticide use. But they're asking these questions. So I was talking to Ray and I said, I've got 2 of my 6 uncles have Parkinson's. He said, well, what did they do? I said, well, one uncle was a machinist. TCE, he said. But the other one did. Welder. Manganese, he said. The science is clear. Toxic chemicals and pollutants are major drivers of today's chronic disease epidemic. What we need now is the courage to tell the whole story. To look beyond, not ignore genetics, but to look beyond genetics, to look beyond those simple things. It's all about your lifestyle choices, we've been told. It's all about genetics. The solution is finding a cure. There's a cure just around the corner. We've been told that for over 50 years. It's just around the corner. And in a way, it is just around the corner, but it's not curing the disease after it happens. It's preventing it in the first place. When exposure is collective and unavoidable, only collectively enforced control can be effective. This is not about admonishing people, slapping them on the back of the hand, changing their diets by one-on-one consultations, although that can be important. It's about thinking about the root causes and how we've all become collateral damage to keep the industries happy, to keep the economy running. We have a choice. We don't have to keep down this road. We don't have to accept the keyhole rule as inevitable. It was a decision, but it doesn't have to be the way it is tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for another illustrative talk. Some of you were here last night. It's a pleasure to hear you once again. Time for questions now, and I forgot to mention that the cards on your table, you can write them out if you'd like. You can simply raise your hand, and Beth is going to come around with the microphone as well.
Hi, thanks for the lecture. Your message sounds, to me at least, remarkably similar in a lot of aspects to what Secretary of Health Kennedy is talking to us about, that nutrition and increased exposure to a variety of chemicals is causing a heavy burden of chronic disease, and that's where we should be looking as doctors and teaching people in medical schools to help make the population healthier and not be beholden to drug companies who promote treatments through expensive drugs and expensive ICU stays and that kind of stuff. Could you just comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment. Jeffrey Rose, who wrote the book Strategy for Preventive Medicine, I think is one of the leading thinkers, he's dead now, but about public health and prevention. I said yesterday that if you were to come up with the top 10 books in public health, his is one of the top 10, and I don't know what the other 9 are. Jeffrey Rose talked about the importance of population strategies, but he also talked about the importance of how those complement clinical strategies. Why, in some ways, perhaps I sound strident, is that we have overemphasized clinical strategies and ignored the population strategies. That will allow us, well, and in particular, certain ones. Vaccines, of course, most of us have supported those, and I absolutely support that in contrast to Bobby Kennedy. So I'm a big proponent of population strategies if they're safe and effective. And so I'm generally a supporter of vaccines. I'm raising big questions about fluoridation. I did last night. But we need clinical strategies like identifying people with hypertension, like finding people that have a cancer and figuring out what to do. We can't change that overnight. But it seems to me that much of the clinical strategies are really interim goals. That the ideal, what we'd be shooting for in 10 years, 20 years, is that we don't have to treat people for hypertension. Now, I say that and you go, yeah, right. Well, traditional societies don't get hypertension. Now, maybe it's inevitable because we live in industrialized societies, but at least we should be asking those kinds of questions. Is it possible? Another Jeffrey Roseism. There's no reason that any country can't be as healthy as the healthiest one. It's because of the environment that we are in. I think we need to be much more critical about some of the industries pushing supplements. That's a big difference I have with Kennedy. I think we need to be very skeptical about all treatments. And we have been in many ways for some things, but we are still letting pharmacies drive too much of this. It's become too focused on profiteering. Now, I've got a very different view now. I live in Canada. I've seen both sides, and I know that we have options about how we operate our healthcare system in the United States. And I know many Americans, I would say the majority, think we should be moving more towards a single payer plan. And that there are ways to do that. We have mostly private physicians in Canada, many more private physicians than you do in the United States. You can call it socialist medicine. All it really is universal healthcare that everybody has access to. So I'm a big supporter of good, safe, effective medicine and population strategies. I'm not a big supporter of supplements. I think we've got to be skeptical, and we've all got to find ways to do that and be honest about it and not get caught up in financial conflicts ourselves. As a university professor, I get a salary, and I shouldn't be taking money that will alter the way I make decisions. I should be making decisions based upon I think is in the best interest of the population, and I got to figure out how I'm doing that well or not. But if I start worrying about making money, then I become corrupted too, at least as a university scientist. So we've got to think about this in big terms, broad terms. But one other thought I would have just to finish up. I think we have to be very careful about not getting caught up in tribalism. Science has to look beyond that. There may be some things I agree with people who I have big disagreements with. I've been accused of sometimes interacting with people who say things that I don't agree with. There are some things I don't even agree with my wife about. There's a lot of things I don't agree with the EPA about, but if they call me and say, "Will you help us develop a policy?" Absolutely, I will. Even if the next day I tell them how they're failing to protect us. And so I think we've got to find ways to come together around those things that we can find agreement with other people, even those on the other side of the aisle, because I'm afraid if we don't, we've got the billionaire oligarchs up here who are intentionally keeping us fighting amongst ourselves. And as long as we're fighting amongst ourselves, they get to do whatever the hell they want. That was a long answer. I'm sorry, but it's an important question, and we've all got to struggle with this. I'm okay with that.
So, as I was a family physician, I was a family physician. I was a partner of players. I spent most of my career talking to people about personal habits, stop smoking, lose weight, exercise more, all that kind of stuff. Should I instead have focused on politics and gotten more regulations through EPA to ban lead and ban plastics and ban all of the chemicals, fluorides and stuff like that? Would that be more effective if I wanted the population to be healthier?
We need people who did exactly what you did. My wife is a developmental pediatrician, and I remember for years I would say, "Nancy, why isn't your society doing more about all these toxic chemicals we know are causing the lines to back up in your office?" They're keeping their heads above water. We can't say that any single person should have done this. What we can say is that as a system, as a society, we absolutely need to do more about upstream population strategies. But I'm not going to tell anybody that what they did was wrong. I think what you did, you did it out of compassion, you did it out of the best interest of your patients. I think that's wonderful. I applaud it. As a system, though, we need to figure out how to deal with both the population strategies and the clinical strategies. Thank you.
On the broader issue, taking it up a bit in the work that you've done in the science space, do you or others that you work with spend much time with economists? In other words, economists?
Oh, yeah.
So in other words, in terms of moving the conversation forward, especially with corporations, industries, they're looking at a benefit and costs, and they're so easy to throw off the social costs of what's going on. And I'm just wondering, from your experience, what you're seeing and if you're seeing any changes in that way.
Yeah, I have worked with economists, particularly around lead. I'm working with one now at the World Bank to help update those costs that I mentioned, the $6 trillion. And I think that's important. At the same time, I don't think and most of the population strategies, the prevention strategies, are cost beneficial. As a general rule, they tend to be more cost beneficial than treatment. Not always, but most of them. And so I think that does become an important argument, but I don't think we necessarily need to wait for those cost benefit analyses, right? We can make it based upon moral grounds. We can We can make those arguments based upon the idea of protecting people. In Canada, we just have a law that was passed that says Canadians have a right to live in a healthy environment. There's over 110, more than 110 countries that have that right to a healthy environment built into their constitution. We don't have it built in our constitution. In Canada, we don't have it at all in the United States. We don't, the United States doesn't like rights like that. Rights to children, rights to a healthy environment. So that might be one thing that then would elevate it into the legal system, that we have a right to a healthy environment. And what does that mean? And that should help to change the regulatory system.
I think, thank you so much, Bruce. And I think we talked to you all afternoon without, so we're going to move on. Oh, this is not on. I'm so sorry.
Now it's on? Yes, okay. So I'm Susan Davidson, and I am a maternal fetal medicine doctor by trade, and I am a member of the Wisconsin Environmental Health Network Steering Committee. I've been a member since 2011. And one thing I should say is that we are always interested in new members. So please see any one of us or give us your email if you're interested in becoming more active. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next amazing speaker, who unfortunately literally has a plane to catch. So Dr. Tamarra James Todd is the professor of environmental and reproductive epidemiology at the Harvard Chen School of Public Health. She is a native of Kansas City, so the Midwest is familiar to her. But she got a degree in molecular biology at Vanderbilt, a master's at Columbia, PhD at Columbia, master's of public health at Boston. So she's been around. She has several main areas of interest. One is the effects of chemicals on the developing fetus and on maternal outcomes, specifically on phthalates and PFAS. And those of you who've been with us at our conference for last year, we had spent a lot of time on plastics. And as you may know, Wisconsin is number 8 in the country in plastic production, despite being 30-something in population. So it's very relevant to us. She's also interested in racial disparities in the exposures of toxicants and in their regulation. And finally, she does work on diabetes. She has had the honor in previous administrations of serving as EPA's Scientific Advisory Board for Chemical Assessment, as well as 2 National Academies of Science committees and the March of Dimes Environmental Justice Working Group. She has published over 130 articles, and one of the things we discovered is that Dr. James Todd and Dr. Lanphear published together, and I didn't know that. So she currently holds 2 NIH grants. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to see what I can do here to switch slides out.
Because it just go
Is it
ahead.
forward? Oh, look at that. Thank you. All right. So I'm really excited to be back in the Midwest. And I'm also, thank you so much for a really beautiful presentation. It totally set me up for what I will be talking with you all about today. So Bruce told stories and the importance of stories. And I'm going to go deep into a story, a singular story, and talk about this issue about chemicals in the context of beauty industry and chemicals and personal care products. And something that you all may not have heard of before, beauty justice. What in the world is that? And I want to kind of set the stage or the tone of this to say that we spend a lot of money in the beauty industry. In fact, we're talking about, and figures kind of vary, but we're talking about over $200 billion. And if you look at revenues, we're talking about over $400 billion. Industry is making a lot of money on us. And that market's growing. It's expected by 2030 to far exceed that. And you may say, what are you talking about when I say beauty products, or in this case, I'll be referring to personal care products a lot. And I wanted to provide you some examples, some of which you may have like immediately thought of, and others you may not have thought about. So cosmetics, hair products, scented or fragranced products, oral care products. I appreciated the question earlier, or things like skin lighteners, hair removal products, nail polishes, and skincare. And I'm going to pause here because I want to make it a little interactive and keep you all engaged because I know that I'm right before a break. How many of you all have a regular routine of things that you use every day? Yeah, many people in the room. How about every week? Things that you kind of use every week? Once a month? Yeah. And I want you to take a moment and kind of pause and ask yourself this question. Why do you use those? Some of them are functional. I mean, I didn't want to come here, guys, without having brushed my teeth. That was important to me. Others, maybe not so much, right? And so I think that's really important because I'm going to be asking you that question of why multiple times throughout this. But let's open the cabinet, okay? How many of you all regularly open your cabinets or when you're in the store and shopping, look at the labels? I love that. How many of you all know exactly what in the world those words mean? Yeah. That's how I feel. I trained in molecular biology, but I am not a chemist and I really don't know. And we just had a really lovely workshop in the community about a week ago. And it was really talking to someone who's a lawyer. She works for the city of Boston, just brilliant, very articulate person who says to me, I have no idea what any of those words say. And like, I got like an 800 on the SAT. He's like, yeah, that. And so I think that there's a critical piece missing because if we don't even understand what those words mean, how do we know how it impacts our bodies, our health? And that's a challenge. And so I circle some of these. I'll be very transparent. This used to be a product in my cabinet. And so, in circling some of these chemicals, what I'm going to show you in just a second is that some of these are what we know now to be reproductive toxicants. Things like you heard we talk about EPA or bisphenol A, but these other phenol compounds that are used for their antimicrobial properties. So things like butyl or propyl or methyl paraben, they have a functional purpose. If we're using something, in this case, this is a hair product. So if you like put your hands in something, you don't want it to grow bacteria. That makes sense. Likewise, we have a whole idea about what we want to smell like or what we think things should smell like. I'll pause here. What does clean smell like to you? So it's a challenge, right? Like we have certain conceptions or misconceptions about what we need to look like, what we might need, spaces and places around us to smell like. And that really translates into what we're exposed to every day. So I have had this slide in my slide deck for some years, and I just went back and looked at this and I was like, oh my goodness, it's updated. It used to be that the average woman was exposed to or used about 12 products a day, exposed to over 160 chemicals a day. Note, use a little bit more, exposed to a little bit less. Average man used to be 6 products a day, exposed to about 60 different unique chemicals each day. Wow, what is happening to the men? We are using more products. Society is changing, right? So more is happening. The average adult is exposed to 15 different fragrance-associated chemicals every day. Now, if those were maybe okay, and we weren't talking about things like lead, I'd be like, okay, but the problem is that we don't do a great job with making sure that things are safe. And I really appreciated the setup, really did, that there are different ways in which we could regulate products. And I don't go into this in depth other than just to say we could utilize a principle where we say, look, we are going to depend and rely on the companies to prove that something is safe. They need to test it. It needs to be done before it goes to market to make sure that it's safe for people. That's a precautionary principle. And other countries, particularly those in the European Union, do a better job of that. I'm not saying it's the best, but I'm saying it's better. In the United States, we have more of a reactive approach. We litigate to regulate. So this whole idea of, being able to, assess safety, it occurs after the market. The onus is on who? The regulators, people bringing litigation up. And so there's really this issue of like, who has burden of proof? And importantly, it makes a huge difference in what chemicals are being regulated. So we're talking about roughly around 1,300 in the European Union compared to about 13 here in the US. Canada, I think you guys have about 500 or so, something like that. I don't know. So I want to set the stage to say that's important to note, but it's also not random. So I really appreciated the slide that you had, Bruce, where you had that soundboard up. And what's being pushed up and pushed down as far as the environmental exposures in that soundboard example isn't random. So even in the context of thinking about, I showed you who's using what products, women are using more products than men are. It's changing, time is changing, but when are people using products? How are people using products? And I kind of came to this as a master's student at Boston University. I was sitting in a class and learning about all of these different exposures that can come from consumer product chemicals. And I left really inspired by this and was working in a molecular epidemiology lab, and we were studying breast cancer. And I happened across a case series where there were 4 young African-American girls. They ranged in age from 4 months old to 4 years old. And they had all developed breast and pubic hair. The doctor asked a variety of questions. Is this precocious puberty attributed to some sort of genetic differences that, are ongoing in the family? No. Are there medications being taken in the home, creams, other things that could contribute to this? No. So he starts asking, like, what are you using? And this issue of, hair products comes up. And so he sends the hair products out. He has a hunch. And I don't know how many of you all may have come up with that. It's the hair products, maybe. I know that would have been hard for me to arrive at. But when he sends them out for independent testing, they contain 3 different forms of estrogen. And so he suggests to the parents, please stop using these products. The pubic hair falls out and the breasts regress. That was going to be my dissertation topic then. And so I was really curious about the lack of randomness there, because these were all African-American girls. These products were not labeled as containing estrogen. And yet the parents, unbeknownst to themselves, were using something that they thought was safe. It was on the shelf after all, not knowing that that's not how we function in the US and that it was harming their children. So I'm going to give this example of phthalates and preterm birth because these are these fragrance-associated chemicals. They hold the fragrance in the product as plasticizers. And I want to start with laying the groundwork for this example that I give to my students. In order for there to be a health disparity, okay, again, this idea that this is not random, that there have to be 3 conditions that are met. First, there has to be an association between whatever group you're studying. Now, we could talk about, women versus men. In this case, again, I told you that women use more of these products, right? It could be lower income individuals and higher income individuals, or urban and rural. Whatever that particular contextual factor or vulnerable group or marginalized population, there needs to be an association with a given health outcome. There also needs to be an association for the second condition with whatever environmental exposure you're talking about. So it could be lead. In our case, we're going to look at phthalates. And then lastly, there needs to be an association with the environmental exposure and the health outcome. My slides got really, okay. Well, hopefully the Mac PC difference won't be too problematic. So the example that I'm going to walk you through is looking at race as the contextual factor. Now, again, I said there's a host of other social determinants of health you could be interested in, but we're going to use this as our example, and preterm birth, with phthalates being something that might be driving this. So first, setting the stage, I probably don't have to say this to this group, we know that there is an increased risk of preterm birth among individuals who are non-Hispanic Black. It's about a 55% increased risk. These data are from Merchant Dimes. And you might say, okay, what does this have to do with, you talked about beauty products. Why are we talking about this? So when we're thinking about differences in products and how people use products, I want to make note that there are important reasons why we use the products we do. I mentioned the functional reasons, but I also want to mention that there's economic power in that when we walk into a place, being able to get a job, we need to appear a certain way. How many people have like purchased a new suit or outfit for a job interview? Yeah. I imagine that you also care about how your personal hygiene, how you show up in that space as well. There's social mobility components to it too. So, as far as like higher SES, higher socioeconomic status, there's an appearance of how you might need to appear to actually make connection. There's social acceptance. So I don't know about you all, I grew up in a family that my grandmother would say to me, make sure that your hair looks a certain way before you leave this house. These are things that the family or your friend group. I grew up also as a child of the 80s. So my friends wore those really cool bracelets and our hair would be like off to the side with the little crimp irons or whatever. Your friends influence what you do. And then other forms of validation, whether that's even like when you are, in a relationship, dating or so on. So when you're thinking about why you use the products you use, why you do what you do, you have to consider all of the story, the full why. All of us have many different identities that we hold, and that impacts what we're exposed to. So that when we're thinking about the intersection of being perhaps a scientist, and in my case, a woman, and in my case, a Black woman, those things have intersections about how I might need to show up in the world to get the social acceptance, to have the ability to get a job, so on and so forth. And that has impact on what exposures may occur or that I'm being exposed to. It's not random. So when we think about things like skin lighteners, we recognize that we live in a society in which having lighter skin has some sort of impact. Having straighter hair and being able to show up in a space with straightened hair may require not just heat, but actual chemicals to straighten, some of which we now have learned contain formaldehyde-releasing agents. So here we have carcinogens. Scented fragrance products, we talk about things like phthalates, as I mentioned earlier, and other plasticizers. Hair extensions, which I'll show you in just a second. Thank you for bringing up lead. Contain lead and other harmful chemical ingredients. Other cosmetic products, long-lasting mascaras and such. Those surfactants, forever chemicals, are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. Nail polishes, and the removers with things like toluene and so on. And so we looked at what were some of the differences? Again, if you're thinking about multiple exposures, and again, that like we are using many products every day, these are data just looking at pregnant individuals. And this is from the Life Codes pregnancy cohort based in the Boston area. I don't expect you to understand or look at all that other than just to note that The different color bars represent different racial and ethnic groups, and you could probably see that there are differences that are happening with respect to each different product type. I'll draw your attention to the fact that for hair gel, perfume, and nail polish, we see that Black and Hispanic individuals use many more of those products, and that they reported using them within the last 24 to 48 hours. Here during pregnancy, we looked at multiple visits, and we see higher cosmetic use among non-Hispanic white individuals. If we look at another type of product, hair products, and these aren't, I remember when I first heard of this study, and I brought this to my doctoral thesis advisor, this is now 25 plus years ago. I want to look at hair products and chemicals in hair products and reproductive health outcomes. She said, well, why would you want to look at that? You're talking about shampoo and conditioner. People readily just wash that right out. It doesn't matter. And I said, no, I'm not looking at shampoo and conditioner. It's how people are using things matters. I'm looking at things that people put on their hair and their scalp that they leave on, and then they do it again the next day and again the next day. So these cumulative exposures that can really impact health. And I wanted to be able to describe that through different types of products. So this is data from the Greater New York Hair Product Study, a study that I founded back as a doctoral student, showing differences of product use by race and ethnicity. And we were in New York, so we could also look at the heterogeneity of the Black community and see differences between individuals who were born and are descendants of U.S. enslaved individuals and people who were immigrants from the Caribbean. So we shared our list of commonly used hair products, and I'm just going to note that how people use things matters. So we did focus groups. I'm an epidemiologist. I'm a quantitative scientist. It is important, though, to work with people across different research areas. And so we worked with a qualitative researcher, and we did focus groups, and we learned things in these focus groups that were very powerful. We learned that people chopped up birth control pills, for example, put them in leave-in conditioner, heated it up, and placed it directly on their scalp. We learned that people would make their own products with mayonnaise and avocado and all sorts of other things. But among the most commonly used products, most of which were purchased from the local stores and shelves, we had these independently tested in collaboration with Silent Spring Institute, located in Newton, Massachusetts. And we found that every single one of the products contained multiple forms of toxic chemicals that were known to be endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so it really debunked this idea that just because it's on the shelf that it's safe. Importantly, and I'll note that phthalates were on the list. They were quite common. Many of these products contained fragrance. But you can also look at our national data. This is data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And we published this some years ago, kind of in looking at this across or at the same time point. And what I hope to draw your attention to is that we're looking at a chemical soup of phthalates, okay? So these abbreviations are different urinary phthalate metabolites. Our body rapidly metabolizes these. We do excrete them pretty quickly. But again, I go back to how do we use things? So that's why I started off with asking you about, do you do things daily? Because many folks do use the same products over and over and over again. And this also confirmed women have higher exposures, particularly of these lower molecular weight phthalates. So this MEP is a phthalate metabolite of diethyl phthalate. It is what I was mentioning to you, the chemical that is used to hold fragrance into products, and our body rapidly metabolizes them, and monoethyl phthalate is the metabolite. And we think that that's the active chemical that actually may have some sort of health impact. And so worth noting, I can only show you a 10th of that concentration because we are very much exposed to that particular chemical here in the United States. But the red bar represents women, blue men. So women have higher concentrations. Also, this particular phthalate metabolite is associated with nail polish. We have, most women, much higher concentrations than men do. But here on this side, on your right, is looking at this by race and ethnicity. And what I want to just bring your attention to is that both African American and Mexican American individuals have much higher concentrations of these lower molecular weight or phthalate metabolites, indicating that there's something going on. And what's been interesting, and this is why I think it's important to ask why, because there were studies that were published over and over and over again that just showed these differences. And if you keep telling that story is going to suggest that there's some sort of biological driver behind that. In fact, when you look at some of the research from 15, 20 years ago, sometimes that line would be in there. There might be like differences in how people are metabolizing these things without giving much consideration for what I showed you earlier about differences in product usage. I just want to show you that it's not just phthalates, those phenols that I mentioned to you that I showed you on behind the cabinet when we looked at the products. These also are much higher in Black individuals. And it's worth noting, these again are national data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Look, 6 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 19-year-olds, much higher concentrations for Black children who are being exposed to these endocrine disrupting chemicals. Okay, so you might say to me, okay, you just looked at the chemicals in by race and ethnicity. What does that have to do with the products you were talking about? And so when we look at, these are data from a prospective cohort study that we found at the Ergo study, also based in the Boston area. And we asked people what types of products they use, and I'm just kind of pulling out hair products. And here, if people reported in the last 24 hours using hair oils, hair lotions, or leave-in conditioners, we created this heat map. So where you see red is where someone, where we see much higher concentration of this particular phthalate metabolite. And so what I want to draw your attention to is that individuals who reported using hair oils have 125% higher concentrations of that monoethylphthalate or that fragrance-associated phthalate metabolite. I've been asked the question, why don't you think you see that with the others? And I will say that a part of it is the base. So leave-in conditioners and lotions have a water base. When people sweat or just moving in their day-to-day life, it sweats out, it falls out. Oils, not so much. They hang out and then people add it again and again. So much higher concentrations of these. I mentioned earlier that braiding hair and hair extensions has made national news twice over this past, within the last year. Consumer Reports came out about a year ago. They had tested braiding hair and wanted to kind of get a sense of what is in it. Much of braiding hair is actually plastic. They're plasticizers. There is human hair, but the human hair is also treated. And so it turns out in the most recent study that just about 2 weeks ago came out, Alicia Franklin published on this, she's at Silent Spring Institute, also found even in the natural and human hair that they still had incredibly high levels of volatile organic compounds and of lead. Why that is in the products, we're not completely certain of. But if you ask consumers, they are like, well, we wash the hair or we soak it in apple cider vinegar, which is interesting, but does absolutely nothing to removing any of these chemicals. Okay. I want your chemical that's in that mixture slide. I was like, really awesome. I needed it for this one. Because what happens, these are not, I'm talking to you about phthalates, talk to you about lead, but these are mixtures. People are using all of these things. And again, while that might not be a lived experience that you have, you can think about the things you do use or a family member does use on a day-to-day basis. And so in thinking about the mixtures, what we did was, again, these commonly used hair products, looking at this and saying, does it actually operate as an agonist or an antagonist of the body's hormone receptors? And I mentioned that these are endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so we teamed up with Lisa Connolly over at the University of Belfast, and we ran these hormone receptor assays. And every single one of them, so look at this by row, was able to either operate in some capacity as an agonist or an antagonist. The plus represents the agonist minus antagonist. 0 didn't do anything for that particular receptor. For our body's hormone receptors. Again, these are things that were on the shelves. People could just purchase, get, and so what impact does that have?
What is G and?
Oh, so sorry, yes. So the estrogen receptor, androgen receptor, progesterone receptor, and glucocorticoid receptors.
GNYA.
The Greater New York Hair Product Study. So that was the one where we asked people throughout New York, what did they use? And that gave us indication of what were the most commonly used hair products.
What are the two different, even with you?
Yeah, so what we did not do, which I don't know, I just didn't want to be sued, was if someone asked us in private, we would disclose what the names of the products were, but in public, we've opted to not disclose those particular pieces of data, but I'm happy to discuss with people what they are. Okay, so I hope that I've kind of proved this point and this point, and I'm just gonna jump forward. But I wanted to make sure that we understood, and this is where I think environmental epidemiologists spend a lot of our time. Is there an association between whatever the environmental exposure is and the health outcome? And Bruce, this is our paper. I didn't know. So these are data from about 6,000 individuals that have participated in multiple cohorts around the US. And it was Dr. Kelly Ferguson's research group, Barrett Welsh, was the first author of the paper that published on this, finding roughly anywhere, depending on which phthalate metabolite you're looking at, about a 20 to 40% increased risk of preterm birth if you had higher concentrations of these chemicals compared to lower concentrations. Okay, I just want to note that I hope what I've proved to you so far is that we saw differences with respect to the health outcome we're looking at by race and ethnicity. We saw differences in exposure patterns, both for the products that we're talking about and for the phthalate metabolite concentrations. And now we see that there's an association between the phthalate metabolites and preterm birth. I want to note that amongst these things, although I've planted a seed, if I stop here, I can't do anything about it. And if I'm talking about a health disparity, I want to do something about it. I want to improve it. I want to make the world a better place for everyone. Okay. So with that in mind, we kind of created this pyramid where many of us walk through our day-to-day lives observing differences that we might see in the world. And as an epidemiologist, and perhaps as other scientists in the room, we do our traditional discovery-based research where we ask questions of what might the chemical be? What might the associations be between that chemical? There might be specific sensitive windows in time, so maybe when matters, or where. It turns out that in the United States, we use a lot of that diethyl phthalate. If you looked in Asia, you actually see that dibutyl phthalate is used more. Place may matter. So how? People who are in the room may be interested in the mechanisms by which things may operate. Those are questions that we ask. But rarely do we get to why. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like thinking about the upstream factors, because it's in the why that we might be able to do something about it. So I spent a lot of my career down here on the individual side of things, thinking about behavior, okay? Did people use products? And I had this really lovely master student. She came to me at a conference. She ended up completing her PhD last year, and she's now doing a postdoc, Dr. Marissa Chan, who said to me, I really think that place matters. And I think that we need to consider access to safer products too. But we first started with no one had really looked at and moved beyond the chemical exposures and the health outcome. And I wanted to see, what do you see when you start looking at the actual products themselves? Because wouldn't it be nice to be able to tell somebody, like, could you imagine you need to reduce your phthalate exposure as your clinical guidance for somebody? I don't know that that's going to work very well. But if you were able to say, you know what, maybe you should think about reducing your hair oil use, maybe even in a certain time period, that might be a little bit more helpful to a patient, for example. So we wanted to go upstream to that and considering that. And so we actually, let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. So we actually did a study, again, this ergo study, and we asked about product use. Again, products seem to be a source of phthalate metabolite concentration and a host of other chemicals. In this case, hair products. And so we're asking again about hair oils, hair lotions, leave-in conditioners. We didn't just ask yes, no, we asked about how frequently people were using them. And we asked about it multiple time points. And what I'll draw your attention to is this, that in late pregnancy, so not early pregnancy, daily use of hair oils, not these others, is associated with an 8-day earlier delivery. There's few things that clinically, because it's a clinically significant finding, there's few things that actually, might be associated with that. And we want to retest that again. But wouldn't it be nice to be able to say to someone, look, in late pregnancy, you may want to use less than daily hair oils. Telling somebody to not do it at all, probably not going to go well. But being able to say, look, we don't see it as much with the less than daily, but we do see something going on. And I'll just draw your attention to this slide as well. So this is looking at the sex-specific birth weight for gestational age Z-score by the frequency of hair oil use. So here, the blue distribution represents the non-users, people who said we didn't do this. The red dashed line represents people who used but less than daily. And the green dashed line represents people who used hair oils daily. What I want to draw your attention to is that you'll notice a shift to the left, indicating lower sex-specific birth weight for gestational age Z-score for both the red and the green lines, and a widening of the tail, so that here you have more babies that are born at lower birth weight for the daily users. In fact, it kind of translates again, sorry that my translation for the MAC to the PC is not working, but it translates to about a 300 gram difference for those who were daily users compared to non-users. So Marissa says to me, Tamarra, that's nice. Let's look at place. Let's look at things that really impact what's available to people and what they can access. Because if you just tell people, look, I use a safer product or stop using, this as much. If they don't have access or availability to do so, then, and the truth was, we didn't know. We didn't know whether or not place mattered at all. So we wanted to go upstream and ask this question. Also importantly, there's a variety of other things that are in people's communities, physicians, friends, neighbors, those things that may influence acceptance and social acceptance, like what are they being marketed to? What is being encouraged for them to buy and purchase and use? So all of those things matter as you're thinking about these more upstream factors, because how can you counter a message? If you're a physician, you're guiding someone in your practice and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, that's not my lived experience. It's really hard to kind of, head off those messages. And I bring this up because this was, and I mentioned to you all as a student at Boston University, I was sitting in this classroom, Dr. Nancy Maxwell was giving a talk on magazine advertisements and targeted marketing. And she was looking at this over time. And so here on the left is from Ladies' Home Journal in the 1950s, was marketing and advertising estrogenic creams that could keep people wrinkle-free and young. It's about, and she noticed in the study in the 70s, that this starts kind of dying out. And actually the Food and Drug Administration says, you know what, maybe you shouldn't do that so much. They didn't make a rule out of this. There was no law or policy. They just said, guidance, maybe you should stop doing that. But it's around this time, even here, this is from Essence magazine, marketed predominantly to Black individuals, Black women in particular, that you start seeing the takeoff of placenta or other hormonally active ingredients in hair products. So this product you can actually still purchase in local stores. It's rebranded itself, but it still advertises itself as placenta. People are like, what kind of placenta is that? It is sheep and cow placenta. People have also asked, why would you have placenta? Because it is thought, again, you have to get around these kind of social and cultural norms, that people during pregnancy have fuller, thicker, longer hair. And in a society that values long, thick, fuller hair, people are choosing to use these types of products. So when Marissa asked the question, does place matter? We went back to historical redlining maps and we overlaid Boston's 24 different neighborhoods. And we looked at, believe this or not, we went to every single store that sold hair products all over the city of Boston, where there were multiple things like Walgreens. We would randomly select within that given kind of neighborhood or community. We have a database now of close to 40,000 different hair products with pricing, ingredient information, and importantly, environmental working group scores based on ingredients. And so we have the hazard score for each of these. And what we found was being in a Hulk grade D or a neighborhood that was redlined, meaning that it had a higher percentage of individuals who were people of color or people who were immigrants, and they were disinvested in compared to a blue or green line community. That red line communities were more likely to have high hazard hair products today. We also looked at gentrification because somebody would say, well, redlining became illegal in the 1960s. Why would that matter? So let's look at gentrification. And it turns out that it's a double whammy. So if the neighborhood was redlined and not gentrified, you still had this effect and it was even stronger. So we created an environmental racism story map that looked at these questions, and what I'm showing you here is a few of the different communities. Here I was looking at Mission Hill, which is actually where Hartsville Public Health is, and comparing it to Beacon Hill, which is where our capital is, and it's a very wealthy neighborhood. It's about a twofold increase of having high hazard hair products or products that have harmful ingredients, and more products that are leave-on compared to rinse off. So more harmful chemicals, ingredients, more likely to just hang out. And so the question becomes, what do you do about it? How can you actually change policy? And I have three ideas to share with you all today. Just kind of moving this further out and getting to the structural factors. And one idea, again, the next slide looks like it is indeed not great, is you all. So really thinking about policy change, not just at the federal level, but policy change with a capital P. How can we change the policies within our own medical associations, within our own groups that have influence and impact? The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology does indeed provide guidance around this. They recommend that sexual and reproductive health providers be knowledgeable on environmental agents. That includes knowing where they come from so that you can provide counseling and guidance. But that you can also think about that in the context of how people are using these products and better integrate this into the training that is happening within the society, that what is valuable knowledge, and being able to improve the policies to address these toxic and harmful ingredients. So we did that a little bit. We ran a clinical trial, and it was called I Helped. The goal was to increase environmental health literacy. How many of you all, I know y'all are here for a reason, but in your training had environmental health covered as a core competency area? A couple of people. That's great. Most of you all did not raise your hands. And that's because in medical school, nursing school, and much of our, clinical training, that is not a core competency area. And yet that's something that people want to be able to cover if someone were to ask you about it. And so we designed a curriculum. It was a narrative-based curriculum that took about 35 minutes for our clinicians to complete. It included collaboration with our pediatric environmental health specialties units and being able to work with folks in the community that shared different identities and could cover different topics in this way. And the goal was to improve environmental health literacy as it related to reproductive health. And I'll note that when we first, we did a pre and a post test, and then we did a post. So we asked people 2 months out, did you engage, did you keep having these conversations as a part of your clinical care? The first thing I'll note is that about 2% of people were regularly covering and discussing the topic of phthalates, fragrance chemicals and personal care products at all, in their clinical practice. And so when you looked at the pre versus post, what you see is that we were able to increase environmental health literacy. The blue is the pre-test, the orange is the post-test. You see much higher scores. But what was really, really critical about this was, yeah, but then what? So we went from 2% to 98% of people were discussing this topic with their pregnant patients. We also wanted to know whether or not there was a difference. If you had higher environmental health literacy, did you have lower exposure or concentrations of these phthalate metabolite concentrations? And what we saw was that particularly protective behavior risk, having higher scores for that particular element of environmental health literacy, as well as regulatory interest, was associated with lower concentrations of these chemicals. And this is among pregnant and postpartum individuals. So if clinicians could kind of educate people around some of these issues about behavioral change, like maybe use less of this product, that could have some impact on reducing risk. And so the other thing that we did was we developed an environmental checklist and provided tools and resources for the clinicians to be able to counsel patients. But it doesn't stop there. When we're thinking about all those upstream factors and thinking about policy change, the people that are involved matter. And so we did qualitative and mixed methods research. This is Marissa here. I think she's a rock star. And this is an actual art show. We asked people in the community to partner with us. And it wasn't just like a partnership like we know it all. No, they know much more than we know. And so they became co-researchers in this partnership. And we co-designed a facilitator in this photo voice where you use photographs to evaluate things that facilitate, in this case, and serve as barriers to finding safer products. We learned a lot. This is one of the images and the captions that was written by one of the study participants, overwhelmed. I don't know how many folks have walked into a beauty supply store. Those places can be really overwhelming, okay? Like you walk in, it's twice as big as this, and it's rows and rows and rows of all sorts of products. And just imagine trying to read label after label. So this person talks about the time that they spend doing this, how much time they lose trying to find a safer product for themselves, for their child, and how much they could get back. So they're like, if we could just do a better job of regulating our products. What was also interesting is who they thought should be involved in the solution. Our lab is really big on doing solution-oriented research. We really want to understand, not just document the problems, but we really want to do something about it. And so the community members really told us that the community, the hair professionals need to be involved in this, researchers and clinicians, and that can hopefully lead to policy change. But I told you, litigation is the way we regulate in this country. So there are a variety of things that are happening. In Massachusetts, the Crown Act was passed after a litigation occurred where 2 young African-American girls who were wearing their hair in a protective hairstyle at school were expelled from their school because the school said that they could not wear their hair in a protective hairstyle with hair braids. And so that act was passed. I encourage you all, Wisconsin still has not passed the Crown Act. The Crown Act allows for businesses, schools to not discriminate against people for how their hair grows out of their head. As my daughter used to say when she was little, you have out hair. And so it's just how it grows out of our heads. And so being able to pass that without requiring people to use harmful chemicals and ingredients on their hair to have down hair, as my daughter calls it, is important because it's overexposing people to chemicals. But also, this other picture is from a litigation that's ongoing with hair relaxers or hair straighteners and breast and ovarian cancer, as well as fibroids being associated and linked with the usage of these products. And this is an ongoing issue, and who really has the burden of proof? And I'll wrap this up to say, this is a long journey. When I first started giving this talk, I would tell people, we haven't really changed laws around cosmetic chemical ingredients since the late 1930s. Luckily, there's been some movement, primarily with states changing things and being able to provide better regulation. And, in addition to the Crown Act, California has really been leading the charge on being able to provide additional regulation. Most recently, in 2023, there was the passing of the modernization, or 2020, end of December 2022, modernization of Cosmetic Regulatory Act, which provided some additional regulations around cosmetics, disclosures of ingredients. For example, fragrance contains hundreds of different chemicals. It's not just phthalates, it's many, many others. So being able to disclose some of that and not give that priority to companies. And you are important as an activist, being able to, connect with community members and really being able to use your voice. I really appreciated that you showed me that the State House was right directly in view with the university. Many places don't have that, but I think it's really important. Sometimes it gets sidelined because they say that's advocacy. You should not, as a scientist, be an advocate. And I think that it's incredibly important for us to use our voices to make change because we provide access to those who have less voice than us. We live in a moment, I don't know why this is not showing up, but we live in an infodemic moment. So that's another reason why your voice is powerful. There's information, disinformation, misinformation everywhere. In the beauty industry, there's so much online. How do we get through that deafening and overwhelm and be able to get information out there is important. And the issue right now is that there's a lot of mistrust and distrust. And if we don't think about what our role really is in the context of that as activists, if we continue to sit in our ivory tower or our clinical practice without giving voice or thought to these issues, it really continues to marginalize whole populations because it simply is not random. So we're doing a bunch of different things. I mentioned this environmental racism story map that we have. We go out into the community every year. This particular picture over on the far side, we have about 4,000 people that come through this zoo event. So we're out handing out recipe cards. We talk about lead, we talk about other things. Our lab has a podcast. Some of the students were like, we really want to get information out there. And so we teach students about science communication, and they launched the Beauty Plus Justice podcast. Feel free to take a listen. It's on all major Spotify, Apple, other major channels. We also talk about these apps that are available to people, but we don't want the onus to stop there on the individual. So it's important for us to participate in national academies and other reports. It's also important, again, I don't know why this isn't showing up, but it's also important for us to educate the next generation and being able to get out into the community. So this is actually work that we do every summer. It's so exciting. And what you can't see is the quote that we got from our students last year, where they say, this is year 6 that we've been doing this, but you make science real for us. Thank you. And so I'll end on the need for us to rethink the questions we ask and our role in science, how we can do more community engaged research and work, and how we can really make science beneficial and real for everyone. Because when and how and why people are using things matters, our message matters. Not scaring people, but providing solutions and tools for people. And importantly, reconsidering our norms. Because improving our policies requires all of us. And I would thank you all. This is my research team, and feel free to contact me. I'm sorry that we're running a little.
Thank you, Tamarra. That was incredible. And we have clinicians, we have teachers, we have policy people. We have our marching orders. So we have time for, can we answer like 2 or 3 questions? Okay. If there are a few questions, please be very succinct and sort of answerable questions.
So you mentioned, that study looked specifically at premature delivery. Have there been studies looking at, early onset of puberty with contact with these chemicals?
So that's where I started. I went back and forth on whether or not I could share both stories with you, and I decided that I could. So I'm glad you asked. So I was working in a molecular epidemiology lab as my very first job at Boston University as a master's student, and earlier onset of menarche or early periods is associated with, for each year earlier, a 20% increased risk of breast cancer. And what I learned from, doing that work was that Black individuals were being diagnosed with breast cancer earlier, and they were more likely to die from the disease. They also were more likely to have triple negative breast cancers. And I was struck by the fact that thinking about estrogenic compounds, what does it mean that, even at the age of 4 months old, we're using products that are hormonally active on young and developing children? Is that contributing to some of the differences we see in early onset of puberty? And in the study, the Greater New York Hair Product Study, in addition to looking at different product types, that was the question that we were asking. And what we found was a 40% increased risk of starting or reaching menarche prior to age 12 if you used hair oils and hair relaxers. So hair oils seem to continue to be the bad actor. We repeated that study in a different study population and actually lowered the age. And so less than age 11, you see about a 2-fold increase risk if you use hair oils in particular. So yes, there is an association.
I noticed on one of your slides, it was Asians didn't use deodorant. Do you know why that is?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So we have done a little bit of work in collaboration with South Cove Community Health Center, which is in Boston's Chinatown, where we asked very similar questions. And what's interesting is that we asked questions around acculturation. And you actually see differences based on what language people speak with their friends. That's why I say those kind of micro communities that we have matters. And where people were born, what language they were using in their home. So sometimes things are culturally, they're socioculturally kind of different. People are using different products. We saw more hair removal products used, and there was use of other types of products that actually reduced kind of sweat and other intake that were different. I will also just say that when Marissa was doing this work, Environmental Working Group has, the most of their work was published on products that were primarily used by the non-Hispanic white community. So it's about what you ask and how you ask it sometimes. And there were fewer products available in communities that were communities of color. The community that had the least kind of hazard score information was Chinatown. And so that there's some differences. And I just also want to say, and oftentimes what will happen, people will make statements of biological difference. This comes up, I do a lot of gestational diabetes research, and people will say, well, it's a beta cell polymorphism that is actually contributing to higher risk of gestational diabetes in the Asian population. But then data show that there's actually differences based on where you're born. Genetics don't change that fast. So there's something else driving that. And one potential factor might be things like these chemicals and who works in industries like nail salon industries, because we see that butyl phthalates are associated with an increased risk of gestational diabetes, for example. So we're looking into questions like that, like why do people use the products they use and what puts people at risk of risk?
I was married to an Asian guy for 15 years ago, and he never wore deodorant, he never smelled, and I worked with some Korean girls too, and they never smelled or used deodorant. So I think it might be an enzyme that they might have or not have that we have. I don't know.
So, hey, Uber is waiting. And we have a break now. There are refreshments. And please take your coffee cups with you to get more coffee because we only have a limited supply. Thanks.
Oh, we want to be back by what, 3:35? 3:40? Okay, 3:40.
Oh, okay. And the clicker, sorry. Let's see.
Turn off the video part.
Let's see. Okay, that works. Great. All right. Okay. So, I'm going to talk about climate change and where we can make a difference in our changing times right now. And I'm going to be coming back to Bruce's theme about the lack of regulations of these of chemicals and upstream. I'm going to be zooming in on what was advertised as the largest deregulation day in US history 3.5 weeks ago on February 12th. So I'm going to get to that and we're going to go full circle. So I'm going to start with the end and give you some of the conclusions of this talk, where you can summarize this entire topic in 10 words. Climate change, it's real, it's really happening. It's us, it's human caused from burning fossil fuels. Experts agree, so 99% of climate change scientists that actually know what they're talking about with climate change agree. It's bad across sectors, bad news, bad outcomes. I'll talk about a few, but there's hope, enormous opportunity. So it's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, but there's hope. So the most abundant greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. You can see that it's been increasing over time. Sorry to say, it keeps increasing. We're now at over 420 parts per million. And we're seeing impacts. Climate change is happening. Here's Phoenix, Arizona, 100 straight days over 100 degrees. The World Meteorological Organization calling out 2024 as the warmest year on record since pre-industrial levels. And last year was ranked as the third hottest year. These are not outliers. You know, this is what we're seeing. The world is really heating up. And with climate change, you know, what actually happens with climate change? Well, the physical attributes are rising temperatures, rising sea level just from thermal expansion of hot water, as well as land-based glaciers sliding to the ocean. But it's not just about temperature and sea level, it's also extremes of the water cycle, more droughts, floods, and fires. And those physical attributes of climate change, they affect our health through multiple pathways. And this is why a long time ago, when I started getting into this, I viewed this as the largest environmental public health challenge of our times. And I jumped into this a long time ago when I saw all these exposure pathways. So heat waves, air pollution and allergens, infectious diseases, water and food security, mental health, environmental refugees. So I'm going to give a few examples and then switch gears and talk about climate action and why it's a golden opportunity right now. So temperatures. Most of you already know that heat kills more people than any other weather extreme. And this is from the National Weather Service. You can see heat right in the middle here compared to the other extremes. How many of you remember the summer of 2021, the heat dome? I hadn't heard of a heat dome until, well, I hadn't heard of one, maybe just a couple of years before that. But a heat dome is a massive heat wave, both in area and in time and how long it lasts. So the heat dome of 2021, it hit the Pacific Northwest, including British Columbia, where Bruce is from. And it's estimated that over 700 people died in British Columbia, over 600 in Washington State and Oregon. And so that was a major event. In fact, there's a new World Weather Attribution Initiative across some of the best climate centers in the world that are beginning to say, okay, here's an extreme event. How likely was this to have happened because of human-caused global warming? And that event of 2021 was made 150-fold more likely to happen compared to if we didn't have human-caused climate change. So in other words, the level of extreme climate that happened there was virtually impossible to have happened without human-caused climate change from burning fossil fuels. Here in Wisconsin, this is looking at temperatures since 1950. And this is from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, or WICI. And this 2026 report just came out Wednesday, so the latest report. So we've warmed between 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1950. And then thinking about extreme weather, this is the number of 90-degree days in our state of Wisconsin. And this is looking at historical and up to 2020 on the left, and by mid-century on the right there. And what we're seeing is right now, on average, we have 9 days that are hotter than 90 degrees. But by mid-century, a few more decades, we'll see almost a tripling in the number of 90-degree days, 26. 3 times 9 is 27, so almost 3 times. So it's not, of course, it's not just about heat waves and heat mortality and morbidity. There are other diseases that are very sensitive to temperature. Mosquito-borne diseases are a big problem. What's the difference between us sitting in the room here, us mammals, and that mosquito on the screen, besides the fact that we don't fly, and Susan and Andy tell me that most of you don't suck blood. So we're warm-blooded, right? Our body temperature is always about the same, give or take a fever. That mosquito is cold-blooded. So whatever the air temperature is, that is her body temperature. And this mosquito carries yellow fever, dengue fever, and Zika virus. If that was a malaria mosquito, an Anopheles mosquito carrying the malaria parasite rather than a virus, the same story. So a small amount of temperature can have a huge impact on biological diseases like mosquito-borne diseases. And so when people say, hey, it was 20 below zero a few months ago and it's going to be 95 this summer, who cares about 1 degree? you talk about biological systems like mosquito-borne diseases, and it means everything to about transmission dynamics. And so vector-borne diseases are very sensitive. This is a systematic review looking at human pathogenic diseases related to hazardous climate. And on the left side, you see the extreme climate, warming, precip, floods, droughts, and then these pathways of diseases. So I've mentioned vector-borne diseases and mosquito-borne disease, but also extremes of the water cycle, flooding, contamination, waterborne, airborne, direct contact like poison ivy. So how many pathways do you think there are that link extreme climate, extreme weather to human health? Over 1,000. Systematic review found more than 1,000 pathways through which extreme weather affects our health. There was mention of hurricanes, and so the other aspect of climate change is more intense storms. This is an obvious one when you look at the relationship between sea surface temperature, which is the green line, and the blue line, which is the power dissipation index. In other words, the strength of hurricane winds. It's a matter of physics. Warmer sea surface temperature brings you stronger hurricane winds. And this was Hurricane Helene. And why was it so historic and such a major storm? Well, the water was record-breaking hot. You know, it was really hot in the Gulf of Mexico. And so this is the other element of climate change. Precipitation, remember, it's not just temperature. Extremes in precipitation is something that has relevance to health, and I'll tell you why in just a second. Here again is from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, and you can see all the dotted counties, that's statistical significance as far as greater precipitation compared to the past. And Steve Vavris, who's our state climatologist, says, you know, Wisconsin is going to become warmer and wetter. And we actually, you know, we know that, you know, there are impacts from flooding. You can see this whole list here, all sorts of problems with heavy rainfall and flooding. And the hash marks, by the way, indicate statistical significance, you know, everywhere as far as increasing in rainfall. So why more rain? You know, with hot air, it evaporates from, you know, soil moisture and you get droughts. But remember, hot air holds more water. So when it rains, it can rain really hard. So that's the concern here. We did a study looking at the Chicago water basins that feed into Lake Michigan and supply water for Chicago, and found that by mid-century, Chicago will see a doubling in the number of combined sewage overflow events every year. So CSO, combined sewage overflow events, it means sewage contaminated water overflowing into lakes and streams because of very heavy rainfall, which is part of the climate change story. Well, with flooding and the contaminated water, what you really saw in the emergency room after floods is asthmatics, because you see a story like this. When you see this picture after floods, that's very serious, and as it's the asthma admissions that are the highest after flooding. And it's not a coincidence that these basements get flooded in poor neighborhoods, and a racist past, a flooded future, the formerly red line areas where if you were Black in America, you were not allowed to buy anywhere other than unfavorable areas. And so, okay, just cleaning that up. Great, thank you. Perfect. I'm glad you're a perfectionist. So, and by the way, you know, of course, unfavorable neighborhoods in a floodplain at higher risk, the same stories with heat waves. Formerly red line areas are more susceptible to the urban heat island effect because governments haven't invested in green space, right? And so you get black asphalt roads and concrete buildings. So same equity story with heat waves as with flooding.
Hmm.
So back to that event of summer of 2021, not only was it record hot temperatures, but it was record drought. And we saw these wildfires in your neck of the woods in British Columbia, but also in California and Oregon that spread all the way across the country. Here's Wisconsin getting hammered with smoke. So the wildfire smoke issue is enormous. Talk about some health impacts of wildfire smoke. But I'll just tell you about the risks of wildfires is going up because of climate change. On the left is a study out of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that there's been a doubling in the number, the area burned attributed to human-caused climate change. And also that human-caused climate change is responsible for over half of the observed increase in forest fuel aridity, that fuels these fires. On the right side, this is out of Stanford University last year, looking at mortality, county level increases in excess deaths due to wildfire smoke, fine particulate pollution. And if you look across the United States, we're seeing lots of wildfire smoke exposure. This is 2021, you can see here, 2023. We don't have 2025, but it's worse. So we're seeing a lot more exposure to wildfire smoke. And that's dangerous. This study in pediatrics found that young children under the age of 5 are especially at risk from wildfire smoke, and that wildfire-specific fine particulate was 10 times more harmful to young children than other sources of fine particulate pollution. The other group at risk, and because Susan is here, and our last speaker talking about risk to the unborn, preterm labor and low birth weight are associated with wildfire smoke. This is out of Australia where they have lots of bushfires. And the point is that even with short-term exposure to wildfire smoke, we're seeing some bad health outcomes. So in young children and also pregnant mothers are suffering from this with their birth outcomes. So that's the bad news. But I would argue that transitioning away from fossil fuels, could this be the largest health opportunities that we've seen? Could this lead to enormous health opportunities? So when I think about 3 sectors and climate action and opportunity, thinking about the energy sector, it's estimated that more than 8 million people die prematurely from air pollution. And of those 8 million, more than 5 million premature deaths are directly linked to burning fossil fuels. The food sector, which is in gray because I don't have time to really talk about it. So the food sector, because of the types of diet that we eat that are unhealthy, and thinking about a high meat diet is not good for our cardiovascular health, but it's also not good for the environment. If the world adopted the universal healthy reference diet, which is sort of the Mediterranean diet, plant-forward diet, very little red meat, that would save 11 million premature deaths every year. And the last sector, which I will talk about, is transportation, and thinking about our over-dependence on the automobile and sedentary lifestyles, as you mentioned, that estimated 4 million lives saved every year because of active travel, cycling and walking. So just across those 3 sectors, that's almost half of all premature mortality. About 50 million people die prematurely every year. We're talking 20-some million. Did I say 1,000? 50 million. So this is, a third to half of premature deaths just across those 3 sectors. And in the United States, even though we have the incredibly important and life-saving Clean Air Act, which is an amazing piece of legislation, we still have air pollution And it's still estimated that 100 to 200,000 people die in the United States prematurely, especially looking at the Ohio River Valley and still with the coal-fired power plants. So we still have a problem in the US. So my team, we looked at, well, what if you could get off of fossil fuels? And so my student, Nick Mayu, who's now graduated, looked at a study asking, across 6 different sectors in the United States, what would happen if we could get away from fossil fuels to alternative energy? And the headlines from his study, from our study, was that cutting air pollution from fossil fuels would save over 50,000 American lives every year, and an equivalent of $600 billion in savings with reduced mortality and hospital costs. So it's a big deal. It's a golden opportunity here. And similar to this study, an earlier study from another student in the Center for Sustainability and Global Environment looked at Wisconsin and developed a clean energy scenario, mostly onshore wind and utility scale solar, that yes, we can have clean energy for Wisconsin. And what would that scenario look like with health effects? It would save almost 2,000 lives every year. Over 30,000 asthma exacerbations. And if you add up the health benefits from reduced fine particulate pollution and ozone, we're talking about $21 billion every year in savings for Wisconsin. So transportation is another sector I want to talk about. In the United States, the cities that have the highest level of walking and biking for commuting to work have lower rates of obesity and diabetes. And exercise doesn't just burn calories. Contracting muscles, they release anti-cardiovascular, cancer, anti-dementia, depression. Exercise is super healthy. So, if we can increase walking and biking across the country, that would be really useful. We actually did a study where we compared the level of biking that we have in Madison, Wisconsin, which metropolitan Madison has about 6% bicycle commuting, compared to the national average, which is less than 1%. Well, that would save about 18 or 19,000 lives every year, if we were able to safely increase biking and walking, active travel around the country. So it begs the question, isn't it time that we design cities for people instead of for cars? And, we're already making great gains with electric vehicles, electric bikes, which, according to this article, is actually having a bigger dent than electric vehicles. So that's a great thing. So unfortunately, though, right now we are experiencing some strong headwinds. And I want to talk about that. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. But the speakers that follow me are going to be jumping on this in a big way, and they're local heroes. But so one immediate thing that happened when President Trump was elected was he froze funding for the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure law. The Inflation Reduction Act is the largest piece of legislation that deals with climate change in world history. $370 billion in climate action incentives to get off of fossil fuels. It was a big deal, and it had huge impact, and things were happening in a good way. But that was frozen. That was the very first assault on this. In our lab, we already were doing analysis on the health benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so if the Inflation Reduction Act continued, by the year 2035, you would see significant reductions in fine particulate pollution. So right now, this is now in the courts, but this is something if that's being, he threw a wrench into that for the funding. This is a major thing that will be fought out in the courts and hopefully will win, and the Inflation Reduction Act money will be released in its entirety. I know that Wisconsin, the EV chargers for electric cars got through. So we will have on all of our highways in Wisconsin, electric vehicle chargers. So that got through, thank goodness. So don't move if you are, the other big thing I want to talk about is the endangerment finding. The endangerment finding was a Supreme Court ruling, it was Massachusetts versus the EPA, that in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that yes, there's enough scientific evidence that indeed climate change does endanger public health, and then required the EPA to do a confirming analysis. And the EPA, from that ruling, they did a 2-year assessment and came and validated, yes, climate change endangers human health, and came out with a ruling called the endangerment finding. And that has been going, that's been what we've been dealing with. The endangerment finding, what this means is that the EPA has a responsibility to regulate greenhouse gas emissions because, according to the Supreme Court, climate change endangers public health. It's part of EPA's mission. So EPA is supposed to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Well, that was going along until this past summer of 2025, when the current EPA decided they wanted to rescind and repeal the endangerment finding. And when they came out with this, they said, based on scientific uncertainty. There, of course, when this happens, there is public comment period. And then just last month, they came out with their final rule. And what I'm not going to talk about is there's a whole lot of other terrible stuff going on, by the way, like deregulating coal-fired power plant rules, reducing PM 2.5 regulations and letting the standard go higher, reducing CAFE standards so cars can keep guzzling gas, removing, this is a big one, removing the cost of human life in EPA decision-making. So that was a big one. Like, we're just going to decide, is this regulation good for industry or is it too expensive for them? We don't, because the value of a statistical life has some uncertainty, let's just not use it. Let's just forget about the cost to humans in EPA's decision-making. But I don't have time to talk about that, okay? Let's get back to the endangerment finding. I want to just point out that what I learned in my old age is how important public comment is, because lawyers told me you've got to get public comment in by the deadline so that it can be used in court. Because if EPA ignores public comment, they can be sued and held accountable. So we got very involved with public comment. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they pulled together a rapid consensus report. So the National Academies came out with a report and they found that EPA's 2009 endangerment finding that human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases threaten human health and welfare was accurate, has stood the test of time, and is now reinforced by even stronger evidence. There was also an expert working group on climate change and health in the United States. That was 114 climate and health scientists across 31 states that came together. It was not a sign-on letter. It was bringing evidence. This group, that we were part of this group, came up with 50 pages of scientific evidence, finding that there's a mountain of scientific evidence that reduces the uncertainty. So let's roll forward 6 months. So 3.5 weeks ago, the EPA came out with their final ruling. And maybe our public comment made a difference because EPA changed the rationale for the ruling. The final rule was not based on scientific uncertainty. So they sort of admit, yeah, climate change endangers health. They argued instead that, well, there's a misinterpretation of the Clean Air Act by the Supreme Court and the EPA for the last 17 years. And, maybe greenhouse gas emissions that heat up the planet, which is a global thing, it's not local, it doesn't fit perfectly with the Clean Air Act. So that's the rationale. It's like completely bogus. And then they also said emissions from the United States from cars and trucks are trivial, in legal term, de minimis, because in the scope of global greenhouse gases, how could one sector in the United States mean anything, right? So I am totally on board with this headline that the EPA repeal of the endangerment finding is completely irresponsible, because the EPA is supposed to protect human health. And if EPA did not argue the science and they know that climate change endangers human health, they are completely just skirting their responsibility. I also want to point out this third point about US cars and trucks not being much of a deal. If you were to compare the emissions from the United States transportation sector to all other countries, total emissions, except for China, India, and Russia, our single sector, transportation sector, emits more emissions than all other countries in the world for their total emissions. So the final ruling that came out was just laughable. And we're seeing, rollbacks on big solar projects, on wind projects. Coal-fired power plants are being asked to stay on longer. So with all of these rollbacks, what I'm worried about is America last when we think about modern energy development, and at what cost. Now, my team is working on the human costs, and so we're actually studying the health implications of these rollbacks. But thinking about energy opportunity and what this is going to do to U.S. industry is a bit scary. When you look at graphs like this, this is from Professor Greg Nemeth. He's one of the world authorities. He's here at Wisconsin, one of the world authorities on solar energy policy and pricing. And this graph, he shows that the price of solar has dropped 10,000-fold in the last 67 years. The price of solar in the last 10 years has dropped more than 80%. So the cheapest way to generate electricity right now is renewables and batteries. There's no argument about, we can't afford renewables. That's an old argument. So it's the cheapest way to generate electricity. And look at this as far as globally, how solar is just dominating, and it's going to be the dominant go-to energy source. And so America is going to be totally left behind. This is looking at projections of solar, and this was from the International Energy Agency, projecting that solar by 2035 would be, go out like that. Well, here's actual. This is actually what is happening with solar around the world. Also, electric vehicles, even though this is mostly China that's driving this, but this is a global graph that since 2020, between 2020 and 2025, we've gone from 5% to 25% electric vehicles around the world. So the US is going to be left behind here. And what can we do in these next 3 years besides hang on tight? Well, first of all, we should know the audience. We should know what Americans really are thinking. This is a survey called the Six Americas Survey. It's done by communication scientists. They gauge the attitudes of Americans, what they think about climate change. Top one is 2014. You can see the distribution across those who are alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. And the dismissive, doubtful, and disengaged hasn't changed much. Of course, these guys get a lot of noise, but look at the those that are either cautious, concerned, or alarmed last year. That's about 70% of the US population. So number one is to know that most people at least 2/3 of Americans. This is across states, this is a very, very good study as far as who they're selecting and surveying, very representative, that, most people are concerned about this. So the first thing to do is to keep talking about climate change and not be afraid to think, oh, these people aren't gonna, they're gonna diss me or something, So keep talking about it, and also join groups to amplify your voice. Bill McKibben, the famous environmentalist, when asked what should the individual do, his answer is be less of an individual. Join groups and amplify your voice. And so we have some great places to go. Healthy Climate Wisconsin, PSR, Wisconsin Environmental Health Network. So really important to get loud and don't stop talking about climate change. And to come back to that first slide, the way to communicate this is, you want to get simple messages repeated often by trusted messengers. And simplify the message. You could do it simplified in these 10 words. It's real, it's us. Experts agree it's bad, but there's hope. And the trusted messengers, doctors and nurses are really trusted messengers. The communication science shows that. So we need we need the health communities to get out there, which is why it's great that these three communities, Wisconsin Environmental Health Network, PSR, Healthy Climate Wisconsin, and others are really stepping up to the plate. So on February 12th, when I watched the whole thing, when Trump and Zeldin got up there and said we're going to repeal the endangerment finding. This is an amazing day. This is the biggest deregulation day in U.S. history. So on that day, we published this article. Trump says climate change doesn't endanger public health. Evidence shows it does. And so, the second thing to do if you are in that type of position and are able to do it is to lead the public narrative with factual science. We can't sit on our heels. We have to be out there, and we got to get in front of the narrative. Our lab is engaged in rapid health assessments of energy rollbacks that are available in real time. We'll publish this in peer reviewed later, but we want to get it out in the public. So we're putting out these white papers, and Brittany Keys and Abby and others at Healthy Climate Wisconsin, they actually used this white paper during hearings at the state legislature, during an advocacy day at the state legislature, and during a public service commission, open public hearing. So we're trying to get out there and show that if you're going to build new methane generators, it's going to be unhealthy. When there's no reason to, you can get away with your renewables. And while the federal government is stagnating and not working on climate change and actually rolling back regulations, the states are stepping forward. So here's one. There are 5 states that are looking at the corporate climate disclosures that corporations have to disclose their emissions. Of course, the federal government is suing back, and they don't want this to happen, but things are happening at state level. And even in Wisconsin, that push for a climate accountability bill was introduced last year. Brittany Keys is the expert who's going to follow me, and she knows far more about what's really going on in the Wisconsin State Legislature, but stay tuned. The other thing, of course, there's this lawsuit. 15 children, including Brittany's daughter, as the youngest, is suing the Wisconsin State Public Service Commission, challenging Wisconsin laws that prohibit the Public Service Commission from considering greenhouse gas pollution when deciding whether to approve new fossil fuel power plants. So these 15 youth they argue that the state's active promotion of fossil fuels is harming their health, endangering their homes, and threatening their future. So with these things in mind, the third thing to do is to engage with local efforts and processes in our state where we can have an influence here at home. So just to summarize those three to-dos, keep talking about climate change and join groups to amplify your voice and have agency. If positioned, try to lead the public narrative with factual science. And finally, to engage with local efforts and processes in our state where we can have an influence. And it goes without saying, continue to contact your representatives and vote for responsible individuals. This is so obvious, but still so important. And we're not waiting for miracles, like the solutions are already here. You know, this is some images from Wisconsin, bike trails, agrovoltaics, electric buses. So we just need to get more engaged and start working on policy, not waiting for miracles. So in conclusion, today we have the opportunity of a lifetime to seize the moment to transition away from fossil fuels, and in so doing, vastly improve our health. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
We're running a little short of time, but we do have time for a few questions.
Thanks for the presentation. I am been involved in renewable industry for about since about the mid-90s or so. So I've seen that curve with the with PV going down. But I did notice that graph was, I didn't think was accurate with respect to countries in terms of their actual emissions. You've got China up there as the top one, but what's missing from the US is the US military's emissions. So US military emissions, when they're actually somewhat calculated and added to the United States emissions, far exceeds China. Far exceeds, I mean, just the Nordstrom, blowing up, the US blowing up Nordstrom, and the methane that came out of the pipeline up there from between Russia and Europe was just, an enormous amount of greenhouse gases. So I think it's important that US military is included in those calculations, because typically you just don't see it. And I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. That's a great point. And then when all the oil refineries are blown up around the world, that doesn't help either. Yeah, great point. Thank you.
I'll give you my question.
Oh, no.
I mean, being an oldster here,
Okay.
remember the era of the Superfund and how we got funds that organized at the community level to have people look at it. I'm not sure we've done a really good job yet. We're doing more than communication side, but I think a number of plastics are beginning to move on with the same kind of community level organization. How do we promote that for the climate change issues?
Yeah. I mean, communications is a huge challenge, as we are living in a sea of disinformation. And you pointed that out as well, Bruce, that I think it's really important to step up and call out the fake experts, to point out the logical fallacies, impossible expectations that science has to be 100% correct, call out the conspiracy theories and the cherry picking. So we need, you don't say to the person right in front of you, you're wrong. You ask them, where did you get your source of information? And then you call that out. But I'll say that not only do we have to do that and prioritize communication, I've heard people say, and I agree with them, that it's not a matter of improving our communications. We are in an information war. And so we need to be very tactical and be really good, because it is a challenge. And climate change it's been polarized, it's made political. It should not be political at all. Our health should not be a political issue. So, it's one of the highest priorities, prioritizing good communication and strategic you know, on the war level of great communications.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for that roller coaster of terror and hope. And you did a great job of pointing out the cost in human lives, but let's talk about the real cost that people care about, money. Obviously, this is going to impact healthcare costs. I know others may have done analysis, but have you also looked at the costs to our healthcare system and that individuals will pay, the people can relate to as to how it will impact their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've done some studies looking at air pollution and Medicare and Medicaid payouts. We have not, well, actually, yeah, VJ Lamai has done some cost assessment of how much more illness and how much this will cost. So VJ Lamai has been looking at that. I defer to his paper. I can't directly answer your question other than, you know, we're going to see more morbidity and mortality, and that has a cost. What we show about the cost savings, if you could get away from fossil fuels, you know, the inverse is, well, if you keep burning fossil fuels, you're going to see 53,000 more deaths and not save them, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think putting all these things into economic cost, because there's the cost of fossil fuels, that rates issues to become an increasing issue that's being reported on a lot. You could probably add in the chemical issue too. I think we can provide a lot of good evidence that when it comes down to affordability, we're headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and Brittany Keys might talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure. A little bit. Okay, never mind. Just keep it away from Pat Remington, okay?
I was just gonna add a kind of friendly amendment too. I mean, piggybacking on that a little bit. So I'm Brian Campbell with Physicians for Social Responsibility, and supporting groups. I really appreciate you mentioning that. We were one of the groups that immediately filed suit. So the slide you had with the press release about the endangerment finding, that was our press release that we did a couple hours after announcing that we're plaintiffs in a lawsuit that we expect will go to the Supreme Court. And part of that argument that we've been working on with our attorneys is to quantify the impacts on our members as health professionals. Like, how is this changing the cost of healthcare, access for patients, all sorts of other health impacts, like you mentioned. The other thing I was going to add, so we had well over 1,000 people make public comments, and we were strategic, like you said, about making sure that we could be able to file suit. There was also, between the summer and this recent announcement, there was another lawsuit that called out the false science. So there was this DOE report that was issued, and other groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists challenged the legality of that hastily assembled group of climate deniers and this false science. So that's another reason why they took out the scientific argument, I think, is previous litigation. So again, over the next 3 years, I think we're already involved in multiple suits, and there will be more to come as they keep rolling back. But all of that depends on, for us, hearing the stories of health professionals, the way the local impacts are playing out, and the kind of projections that you're talking about.
Brian, thank you for adding that. That's where the action is now. The PSR, the American Public Health Association, American Lung. I think you have about 18 or 20 organizations on this huge lawsuit. Because I only talked about Tony's lawsuit, but that's the big lawsuit in Washington. That's major. Thank you for your leadership on that too.
So Jonathan, just to mention, Clean Wisconsin is also in on that lawsuit.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being so patient. It's a long afternoon, but now we're into an exciting part of our program, which we always have at the end, which is looking at community environmental justice and groups that are working in Wisconsin to make Wisconsin a better place to live. We're going to have 3 speakers. They're each going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're hopefully going to have about 30 minutes to ask questions to the speakers. And when you do, if you could use the cards on your table and tell us if it's directed toward one of the three speakers. And I'm going to give just a brief introduction to all three of them to start out with. Dr. Brittany Keys is now the Clean Air Policy Manager at Healthy Climate Wisconsin. She's a doctor of physical therapy. She did her undergrad, I think, but her doctorate of physical therapy at the University of Iowa. She served in the Beloit City Council as a member in 2020 to 2022 and was the vice president at one point and did some great things in Beloit. You know, the people who know about Beloit, she helped them with an integrated environmental and social sustainability that put into the city's strategic plan. Beloit's goal is to have carbon neutrality by 2040. So big lift, but and Beloit is now is now noticed as a green tier community. She mostly, I know her for two things. One is that she worked did a collaborative community science effort to monitor air quality locally. So to be able to give some facts to the city council and the people that were voting on this, to say, we have a problem here. And now that has become something called the State Line Clean Air Coalition. So they're doing that around the state. I saw her work a lot in, I went to the Healthy Climate Wisconsin conference a couple of years ago, and there were these wonderful people there who were getting an award from Healthy Climate Wisconsin that worked up in Superior to stop a big methane, new big methane plant. I mean, so far stopped. And that was great to see people getting out. There were, local people who lived in the neighborhood, some of the tribes that were going to be affected, and it was really people coming together to say, we don't want this here. And that's really what it takes. She's now the Climate Justice Chair of the NAACP here in Wisconsin at their state conference. And I know her because I just had the big pleasure of spending maybe half an hour meeting Clint Anderson, who's the Assembly Rep for Wisconsin, with Brittany. And I can tell you, if you want to take somebody with you to do advocacy for the state legislature or beyond, Brittany is the person. The middle person there is well known to all of us. She's a Wisconsin Environmental Health Network steering committee member, Emily LuyTan, who got her BS at Dartmouth College in anthropology and geography. She now works in a research lab that uses geospatial analysis and environmental epidemiology research. So she's still working at Dartmouth, but she's from Beaver Dam and still lives there. That's how we have the pleasure of working and knowing Emily. She worked on our last conference and has revamped a lot of our websites, which has been wonderful. So more information, because one of the big things that WEHN wants to do is be a source for good educational information for the communities in Wisconsin, people in Wisconsin. And our not least but last person from Midwest Environmental Advocates is Adam Voskuil. Did I say her name close? Voskuil. And Adam is a UW grad. He had a BS in conservation biology and sociology. And he has a certificate in environmental studies, as well as something that I never knew existed, an integrated studies of science, engineering, and society. So go for it. Those, one of the things the UW is noted for is trying to put people together and get them out of silos. And then before he worked for MEA, he clerked for 3 judges in the Dane County Circuit Court. And now at MEA, he focuses on agricultural law and policy issues and is going to talk about consolidated animal feeding operations, which he's going to tell you more about the definition, but it's livestock or poultry farms and also pigs of greater than 1,000 animal units and what that does to our air and our water in Wisconsin. So welcome to all 3 of you. I'm going to hand the mic over, I guess, to Brittany, and you guys can work down the, or you want to come up here? Better? Okay. Okay. There we go. I can end it up.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, very well. All right. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm so grateful for everyone here and the opportunity to share. And I'm going to be speaking about fighting gas plants in Wisconsin and why health professionals are uniquely positioned to lead in this fight. And I'm from Healthy Climate Wisconsin. We're a statewide organization of health professionals working to address climate change to improve the health of our patients and communities. And I'm here to say you all have superpowers in this space, and I want you to leave feeling really empowered to use them. All right, and so in my 10 minutes, I'm going to share briefly health harms of gas and gas plants. You all really know this sound science. Power of your story, because it's like talk about the science and your stories. How is this impacting you and your patients? The Wisconsin gas rush, and then review because it's here and data centers are making it worse. And then talk about a couple plants that we've been involved with where health professionals have led with organizing, and then a wrap up. So I've got a lot to get through in 10 minutes. So, all right. So natural gas plants, the science is sound. This is an article from 2012 that looked at pollution from gas plants in a 2-mile radius and looking at hospitalizations. And what they found is when they tracked pollution and then hospitalization and ED visits. And as the air pollution around the plant went up in that 2-mile radius, so did hospital visits and admissions, and especially in our elderly. Another study, a little bit older as well, from 2012, found association between if you live in a zip code with a methane gas plant, you are about 10 to 20% higher risk of respiratory disease, asthma exacerbation, COPD, and just hospitalizations from regular respiratory illness. And I will say that I want to flag that there's a time gap a little bit from some of this research. And I also just want to reflect on the power of naming the villain, because who funds a lot of our labs, right? Where does our college play basketball? Who sits on boards of regents, right? So how might we be being influenced with even some of the science available? Also need to level set and ground set that Wisconsin is way behind in our energy sector with the percentage of our in-state energy that comes from fossil fuels. This is from 2021. We were at 78% of our energy came from burning coal or gas. The latest data available, we've made progress, and we are now to 72% dependent on burning fossil fuels. All right, so the Wisconsin gas rush. So all these little dots in Wisconsin are established gas plants or fossil fuel burning plants, and then the red ones were kind of in this last year or so where we've had proposals. And where we have gas fights or have had them recently. We're going to touch on a few of these, but we have Beloit, Superior, Oak Creek, Paris, Kenosha County, Darien, Eau Claire, Portage, Wausau, Sheboygan, Marshfield. And as I've mentioned, data centers are making everything worse. So starting with home, I'm from Beloit, Wisconsin. This is Alliant Energy is our utility, and in 2017 they proposed, or 2015, a big expansion of their gas plant. And we had before emissions lower than Dane County. They expanded, we went up, and we haven't stopped. So Dane County's made progress with their climate goals. We have gone way far backwards. And we are also under monitored and don't necessarily have that organizing people power per se. And as Anne shared with the introduction, having been on council, I became aware of this problem. How are we going to meet our goals when we have some of the highest emissions per capita like in the country because we have lower population? Also, the DNR is like under monitoring to not monitoring us. And so we started a community science project. And then in 2024, IQ Air deemed us the most polluted, to have the most polluted air of any regional city or smaller city in the US. So I also want to flag, if you're not being monitored, it doesn't mean you don't have a problem. Our public health metrics said, like, we have a problem. The amount of pollution that the utility was reporting said we had a problem, right? And so we weren't getting anywhere just with the initial study, so we established the coalition, and it's a group of nonprofits, concerned individuals working on to a future where we all have clean air to breathe. And so we are pushing for improving public health in our area. That was established, and then I learned that Superior had a big gas plant proposed. This is in 2024. So then we're going from southern part of the state up to Douglas County in Superior, Wisconsin. They were facing NTEC, over 600 megawatt new gas plant. They had the utility say, oh, this is gonna bring jobs, this is gonna be great. No, there's no harm to anybody. Okay, but where were they putting this? They were putting it like in a residential area, right? And then actually, let's see, okay, go back. It was also right next to an indigenous burial ground, a cemetery, and it was going to be disruptive, and like elevating traumas that have been long-standing and generational. So we were able to collaborate with health professionals, tribal leaders, a physicist, and the League of Women Voters held a forum. And I spoke to, boy, 5 years down the road, what happens to your community? What happens to public health? And then we had one of our colleagues elevating from a nursing perspective, the harms with like childhood asthma. And they did invite the DNR and the utility. They did not show. They had more than 100 people come in the room to learn. Okay, so this is just health providers coming together with concerned individuals, sharing the health message and the story. And from that point, this was just the beginning. They came together and they said, we can't have this happen to us. They did develop, established Neighbors Against NTEC, started organizing, and started packing the forums. They reached out to their elected officials, and you can see some familiar faces here. Abby, HCW's executive director, going up for plan commission meetings, packing the forum at council meetings, a med student, elevating the health message, impact on the communities, and the local leaders listened. They voted against the zoning changes in the road vacation and were able to pause and then thus block the project. In a sense, I'm pretty sure the fork is in it. We have to celebrate the wins. Okay, Oak Creek and Paris, Southeast Wisconsin, We Energy's proposed another $1 billion mistake while we're still paying off other $1 billion mistakes. Healthy Climate Wisconsin Union of Concerned Scientists ran a study of the health impacts from the pollution they were already reporting would happen. It's big. There's lots of pollutants. We know it's bad. We modeled out the health harms of the individual plants, and you can see that we have almost 100 million every year in health-related costs just from the one methane gas plant in Oak Creek, and over 25 million that's for the 128 megawatt gas plant. And this is 1100 megawatt. And then you can see this is the distribution of the health related costs and health harms. That's from the 128 megawatt gas plant. Remember all those circles on that gas rush map? And then we have, this is Oak Creek. I'm sorry, Michigan and Northeast US, right? Like the pollution we do here doesn't just stay here. We had community education. We did outreach and knocked doors. We rallied before the hearings, partnered with partner organizations that do amazing work, grassroots work in this space. Elected officials, some came out and spoke with us. We had record turnout in front of the Public Service Commission. We had health professionals testifying online and in person. And the power of the health voice was heard, was quoted by PSC staff, was quoted in the papers, and the headlines shifted. Instead of this is happening and it's good for jobs, it was people are concerned for their health. We were making a difference. We had written comments. That's my daughter submitting comments on the docket. But the PSC approved it. Okay, so we don't win them all, but there's wins along the way, right? So we're organizing and we're going. And then, so this is another win, I have to end on. So up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, this is the power of organizing and the health voice. October of this year, forest and park meeting, item number 8, sale of county land to Vitus Energy for construction of new reciprocal internal combustion engine. This was flagged for us, and under 48 hours, we had like 3 or 4 members ready and attending virtually and in person at this committee, Parks and Forest Committee meeting. And we're able then to reach out to some of the members because we had members up there locally. And they decided not to sell, and the Vitus Energy pulled out before it even hit the greater board. So the power of hearing about these projects early, reaching out early, getting out with the health message, we can make a difference. This was a 160 megawatt peaking plant that we prevented by organizing it in under 48 hours. And any one of you can be part of that. All right, so in conclusion, I'm right about that. Health professionals are trusted messengers, and the health message and impacts resonate, but your story is what is most powerful. Continue to work to support and elevate frontline communities, speak to your expertise, and engage regulators. Like your space, we've been told as health professionals kind of stay in your lane, but your lane and your space is in all the spaces. And that's where you're needed. So talking to the PSC, the DNR, and the state legislator, and again, engage lawmakers and demand system level change, because that's what we need, and we need it fast. So with that, I thank you.
Okay, amazing. I'm so glad to follow Brittany because my presentation is directly related. Of course, Brittany mentioned data centers, and to introduce myself, thank you, Anne, for the introduction, but my work is specifically around using GIS and geospatial analyses to see how industrial air pollution, chemical exposures, and land use change impact human health. And so that's how I got involved with WEHN. But I'm also here today because I live in Beaver Dam, and I am a community organizer now in the middle of a fight against a $1 billion, 800-acre data center coming across the street from my house.
Oh.
So Beaver Dam, what is that place? Small town, sleepy town, cows, agricultural fields, a Walmart, classic small town Wisconsin. And it was the kind of place, I was born and raised there, and it was the kind of place where I thought I would always have an anchor, and it would always be a stable, constant place. But that all changed in September of 2024 when we were talking to a neighbor, and they mentioned that the field across the street from my house was going to become an industrial site. Big question mark for me. What could that mean? As an environmental epidemiology researcher, my head went to the worst possible outcome, like a chemical plant. But when I went to the city council and the town hall to try to ask questions about what was going on, I was pretty much turned away at with from every question that I asked. I was even told by the city administrator, why would you care? Why would you show up to ask questions? And I was completely taken aback by such an insane thing to say to one of your constituents. But what I ended up finding out over the course of many months as I watched the city council unceremoniously annex and rezone 800 acres of land to industrial zoning, all with me and my mother being some of the only people in the room during these huge decisions for the town. We realized that, well, it wasn't until months later that we realized, after all of these decisions were made and the development agreement was already signed and done, that it was a data center coming. And at that point, this is how Alliant Energy was advertising the land. And it turns out that one of the biggest tech companies in the world, Meta, is literally coming to my backyard. And I was up many nights thinking, how could this possibly happen to a small town in Wisconsin? And how does the largest industrial development in this town that this town has ever seen and will ever see, how did this happen with no one really talking about it, without any community consent? And turns out this is all by design. This is a deliberate playbook in how these data centers are being developed across the country, not only in Wisconsin, but also around the world. And secrecy is baked into every step of this process.
And these are, of course, all things that I had to learn, unfortunately, in hindsight. But I'm happy to be part of organizing groups that are trying to help other communities who gained this information before it's too late. And so in Beaver Dam, the situation was that Alliant Energy, as Brittany has talked about, one of the state's biggest monopoly energy companies, quietly aggregated this land from individual landowners without telling them what it was going to be used for. And then, in their own words, they were hunting for a whale. And of course, as an energy company, what's a bigger catch than a data center? So from there, the process is designed to keep communities like Beaver Dam in the dark. The city signed an NDA with a shell company that we now know is associated with Meta. And they used project code names. Ours was called Project Wave. And they finalized all the utility agreements, development agreements, all before the public ever really heard about it. And no one showed up to public hearings that were being held in the city hall because nobody knew there was even something to be talking about. And once all of these things are done, construction has already started in Beaver Dam. And as we've seen in Mount Pleasant, once they come, they start to expand. So this pattern of secrecy and speed is not unique to Beaver Dam. It's happening across the state and across the country. So to back up, why do we care about data centers? There are 51 data centers currently operating in Wisconsin with 11 proposed. And it seems like every week in our state coalition group chats, there's a new data center coming up. So why is there this boom happening? Data centers are the physical infrastructure for our daily lives. So they're massive warehouses filled with servers that are running 24/7, generating enormous amounts of heat that must be continuously managed. And this is where our emails are. This is where the cloud really is. This is how we can stream Netflix. And so data centers are not new, but the speed and scale of development is because of the advent of generative AI. A single ChatGPT query uses 5 times as much energy as a simple Google search. And there's an enormous profit incentive to build as much as possible, as fast as possible, with very little consideration of the impacts on the communities and the ecosystems and our natural resources. So while AI might seem like magic, there are very real, visceral, physical consequences in the real world. And so, given my work, my 9 to 5, I was, of course, interested or concerned about the health impacts of this development coming. So this is what I learned, and I'm going to piggyback off of a lot of what other people have said today, so I can maybe speed through this part of the presentation. But one of the most studied impacts of data centers is on air quality, and data centers maintain a lot of on-site diesel generators that companies describe as being used for emergency backups only, but they have to be tested many hours per month. And so they emit, of course, air pollution that we know is well studied to have documented health consequences. But the larger air quality issue is actually from energy consumption, which a lot of people have talked about today. And just two of the hyperscale data centers that are coming to Wisconsin will use more than the electricity of every household in the state combined. So the demand for new data centers in the state and across the country simply cannot be met sustainably. And so the pace at which these facilities are being built will require them to use majority fossil fuel energy. And there have been studies that, like someone asked about previously, about the health burden of this type of pollution directly about data centers. And I'm not going to go into the details, but total annual public health burden is estimated to be $20 billion by 2028 in the US alone. The next thing that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about in the news in concern with data centers is water use and water contamination. And that's because, of course, these data centers, the servers get very hot, and so you need a lot of water to cool them down. And traditionally, data centers can use millions of gallons of water a day to do this cooling. And newer data centers are coming out with seemingly less water intensive cooling systems, but actually they require more energy to operate. So since 70% of Wisconsin's freshwater consumption is already tied to energy production, we aren't really solving or addressing this issue of water consumption by turning to those newer cooling technologies. So we're just moving it offsite. And that's not even to mention, and that's not even to mention toxic waste or water contamination, because I have not been doing my slides. Because the server hardware only has a few years of lifespan, creating constant cycles of hazardous material, batteries, cooling chemicals, electronic components that are underregulated and underreported. And the burden of disposal falls disproportionately on lower income communities and communities of color. This is not incidental. This is a well-documented pattern of environmental racism, and this is just how data center industry is operating. But there's a lot of work being done in the state, and I'm proud to be a part of many groups and coalitions that are doing amazing work. There are currently 7 major data centers pending in the state of Wisconsin, worth over $57 billion. And the similar playbook of secrecy that I talked about is happening across the state. And the organizing that's happening is happening on the hyper local scale, which is very exciting. And that's what needs to happen, because in every context, there needs to be different strategies. But there is an amazing unifying thing that's happening. Since doing this organizing in Beaver Dam, I've been in this struggle with people from across the political spectrum. And I think that the fact that a corporation coming in and changing the entire character of your town and your resources and your land and the water, that's a very unifying concern. And so I've learned that despite these manufactured, as other speakers have said, manufactured tribalism, most people have the same worries and the same hopes for the future. So there's a real statewide movement that's being formed, and there are concrete steps that communities can take right now before a data center is even in consideration in your town. First of all, get to know what's going on in your town. That was one of my biggest takeaways, seeing as I was the only one in those rooms. Also, organize early and loud, and pretty much the same go-to as Brittany was saying, showing up for public hearings, coming to the PSC, public comment periods, DNR public comment periods, and pushing for preemptive protections against these types of developments in your area within your city ordinances. At the state level, there's also proposed legislation that would prohibit data center construction until real environmental, economic, and labor safeguards are in place, including a ban on NDAs like what happened in Beaver Dam. And sorry. And the PSC and the DNR are key places key pressure points to be putting community voices. And so to conclude, I wanted to think about a couple thoughts about AI in general, because AI is not neutral and it's also not inevitable. The version of AI that we're seeing right now, this version of maximum unregulated and growth at all costs AI, is a choice. And it's a choice being made by corporations and governments largely without our consent, and the costs are being distributed onto communities, workers, and ecosystems in our climate. And the data centers are just the physical infrastructure that makes this technology possible. The entire supply chain of data centers is from the mining of the raw material to the exploitation of workers around the world to unregulated outputs of AI. These are all extractive and toxic systems. So at every step, the burden falls upon the people who have the least voice. And so this is a public health concern, and that's why I'm happy to be here with all of you today in this particular room, because these are questions about our climate future, and the people here who have dedicated their lives to understanding how the environment impacts health are exactly the people who should be in this fight. And the decisions about AI are not sealed and done yet. And so there are many ways to stand up, and as a citizen, as a practitioner, and as a consumer, asking these hard questions about what you do in your daily life and communicating with other people in your communities is going to make a big impact. Thank you.
It's a lot to live up to. Hi everyone, my name is Adam Voskuil. I'm a staff attorney at Midwest Environmental Advocates. I am so thankful for my other two panelists. They did an amazing job, and I don't know if I'll fill those shoes, but I appreciate everyone for being here, and I'm excited to talk about some of our work. I'm going to pull this up a little taller. So to start, have all of you heard of Midwest Environmental Advocates? We're a relatively small shop, but I'm hoping so. But just to give a brief background, MEA is a nonprofit environmental law center. We're based in Madison. I think are we double digit folks now? 10? I think we have 10 staff, but we are very mighty. And as it says on the screen, we work to protect the all people, or the rights of all people to healthy land, air, and water. My work specifically is on industrial agriculture. MEA has been around for 27 years now, I think, at this point. And I believe since its inception, we've had a position that really focused on agriculture and groundwater and surface water contamination that flows from that, partially because Wisconsin has such a strong history and ties to agriculture, and also because we have some pretty good laws in the state to protect communities from water contamination. Doesn't always work, but it is a goal and one that we strive for every day. And then just a last kind of point for our work, it's something that I'm really proud of. MEA really likes to focus on a scaffolding or a community lawyering approach where I'm not coming into communities and telling them what to do, how we get certain things passed. My role is really to support the goals of each of the groups that I'm working with. And sometimes that's litigating. Occasionally that's advocating for policy changes. It can be appearing in front of town boards and informing them of what their obligations are, what their authorities may be. And sometimes it's suing the DNR, which is always fun for me. I jest. I will say, I think everyone is always striving for clean and healthy water. I don't want to belittle the work that the Department of Natural Resources does. And it's always a balancing act. But the folks that I work with are often coming to me at some of their lowest points. They're talking about how they turn on tap water, the water from their tap, and it is coming out brown, right? We've seen pictures from Kewanee County from a decade ago where folks filled up their bathtubs with brown water that was contaminated with E. coli and nitrates. I'm working with folks in Portage County or in the western portion of the state where the levels of nitrate contamination are far exceeding what you would see under natural circumstances. And they have a right to clean water. They deserve the ability to turn on their taps and expect that themselves and their family can drink what's coming out of those taps. And so I get to take that power and that energy and really advocate on their behalf. And I'm really thankful for it. So I cut like an hour and a half presentation on what CAFOs are down for 10 minutes. And so we're gonna bounce around and I'll try to explain it, but concentrated animal feeding operations are industrial operations. They're not the typical farm that you see on the idyllic countryside. They are extremely large operations. The regulatory cutoff is 1,000 animal units. That's a term that is different based on different animals. So 1,000 animal units is 700 dairy cattle. It's 1,000 beef cattle, something like 4,000 or 5,000 swine, and like 20,000 chickens. All of those are essentially, when you start exceeding that number, that's the time that you are regulated by the Department of Natural Resources, or in other states, the EPA. And we've seen a steady increase in concentrated animal feeding operations in the state over the last 20, 30 years. And so on the left, you see the path, the total number. On the right, you can see how they're cited. And I always find this really interesting. There are other maps of the state that show things like groundwater susceptibility or hydrogeology. And you can see it's really interesting when you overlay those that places like the northeast portion of the state, Door County, Kewanee, Brown, Manitowoc, those are some of the highest susceptibility regions of the state for groundwater contamination. They also are very clearly a place that CAFOs exist and proliferate. I think at last I checked, Kewanee had something like 19 CAFOs. There are more and more popping up in Door. This map is a little old. I think there might be 3 now as opposed to the 1 that you see. And so all that to say, the uneven distribution and the fact that they're overlaying really susceptible areas means that folks in certain areas of the state are really having to confront this more so than others. I don't know if I have an explanation. Okay, so we'll use this slide to talk about where the contamination comes from and how it presents itself. So, concentrated animal feeding operations are going to be discharging to waters and emitting air contaminants in a number of ways. In Wisconsin, we see primarily dairy CAFOs, and so that's mostly what I'll talk about. I could certainly spend more time on chicken CAFOs or swine, but I'm most well versed in dairy. Dairy cows, the waste that is produced, the manure is all generally stored in manure lagoons. So large open air pits where it sits in the millions of gallons for days or months before it is eventually spread untreated on fields. Those lagoons have a known seepage rate. So the actual production site where the cows are held is going to be discharging to groundwater straight down. Depending on where it is in the state, the rate may be somewhat different, or the amount that is actually reaching groundwater, but there is an allowable seepage from those locations. In addition to that, though production sites are supposed to be zero discharge off the surface, there are occasionally flowages or vegetative treatment areas that's supposed to remove things like phosphorus and other bacteria from getting into surface waters. Those obviously aren't perfect tools either, and so you'll see some discharges from the production sites also off into surface waters. Jumping to the fields themselves, that liquid waste is spread on fields. We've seen economic studies that show how far manure gets taken off-site before it's eventually spread. It's costly to move liquids far distances. So there's an economic incentive to spread as close to the production site as possible. And so though these operations have nutrient management plans, still you'll see loading more often on near fields as opposed to further fields. And nutrient management plans, which are the primary way that CAFOs are tracking how much is being spread on any given field, don't prevent discharge to groundwater. They're simply intended to minimize. And so the result of that is that once particularly nitrate gets past the root zone of plants, it is slowly working its way down into groundwater. And because the majority of rural Wisconsinites are drinking from private wells, their wells are then sucking it up. The Groundwater Coordinating Council puts out a report every year that talks about the state of the groundwater in particular, and they note annually that nitrates are growing in frequency and severity across the state, and that agriculture is the predominant source of that contamination. In addition to the nutrients or nitrates that are making it into the groundwater, phosphorus sits on the top, and at precipitation events will run off fields. And we're in Madison. I assume folks know about the algal blooms that occur in the lakes every year. That's not localized to this portion of the state. We see phosphorus impaired waters across the state, again, from runoff from fields predominantly. All that aside, we also have air emissions. Manure lagoons also emit predominantly nitrous ammonium and hydrogen sulfide. There it is. It's not right. Those emissions aren't regulated by EPA, but we know that they exist. They are particularly prevalent at swine operations, but they are a major issue for CAFOs as well. And all of those things combined, when folks reach out to MEA to ask, what can we do about this? These are the threats that they are often talking about to me. So the surface water and the drinking water, huge things that people bring up. The other stuff that I didn't realize until I started in my role, people talking about diminished property values, not just because they're living next to it, but because nitrate contamination is shown to drop your property value by something like 20%. It will rebound if the nitrate fixes itself, but there's not always a guarantee that that will happen. And then increased truck traffic. Again, an issue I wasn't aware of before I started at MEA. Those heavy trucks with the big tires that allow them to actually move on the fields tear up roads in rural Wisconsin. And all of these places don't have the financial capacity to repair those roads every year. So just a little quirk. I always enjoy bringing that up. Not enjoy. All right, so that was your CAFO Law 101. You're done with your first semester, I guess. How are CAFOs regulated? So we have the Federal Clean Water Act that identifies concentrated animal feeding operations as a point source. Federally, though, outside of the state, a couple of problematic decisions from the early 2000s have basically made them essentially unregulated entities outside of Wisconsin. The EPA has a very limited capability of regulating these things. Luckily, Wisconsin has a delegated Clean Water Act program that explicitly protects groundwater. I believe that program was approved by EPA in 1978. And so as a result, our state WIPD's program, the Wisconsin Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program, mandates that all concentrated animal feeding operations have a permit in order to operate. When you are obligated to have that permit, you have to meet certain requirements in these three laws. I'm a lawyer, so I like citing things. I know that it's not always interesting to everyone else, but things like having a nutrient management plan, managing certain setbacks from property lines, or I think that there are also reporting requirements annually, things like that. It's not perfect. And luckily in 2021, our Supreme Court issued a decision that said that DNR had additional authority to require more terms in order to protect waters of the state, ensure compliance with water quality standards. And it's based on that 2021 decision that we've been litigating and doing a lot of advocacy since. And then the last thing I'll talk about on this slide, I have no idea how far I am on time, probably over, is local zoning. So I do a lot of work with town boards and talking with individuals trying to advocate for better local ordinances. It's a growing push across the state. It's currently growing in western Wisconsin, Pierce County, Crawford County. There's Bayfield if you go all the way up north. And we're starting to see discussions sweep across the state where people are realizing the state regulators aren't, in their perspective, not doing enough to protect their resources, and they're taking it into their own hands. It's been a really interesting development. So this is basically my closing slide because I knew I was going to talk on all of these too much. One of the things that I really enjoy about my work, like I said, is the community organizing and the community lawyering aspect of it. And so I really wanted to take away some of the things that I've learned over the last 6.5 years doing this specific work. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to meet people where they're at. And I mean that both physically, getting to drive across the state and hold in-person meetings in church basements, in people's houses, and explain to them the law and their power in changing it, but also recognizing that for better or worse, these people have often had to become their own experts. They're doing Googling on their own. They're so motivated in this work, and it's really interesting. It's really great to see, that I can rely on some of their expertise. They know the land better. They know who owns the land. They know what's getting spread on the fields. And so, being out there and talking to them and then being able to rely on their expertise has always been something I've really enjoyed. Scaffolding and supporting is again the idea that I'm taking their goals and their final, the expectation at the end, and trying to find a way to get there. I'm not superseding what they want and telling them this is what's best for the state. Let's only do this. Really understanding, like I said, these are some of people's worst experiences, and taking that frustration and oftentimes trying to turn it into opportunity or action items is something that I find really important. And going with that, identifying options and really letting them know that we could sue someone. I'm not always sure that that's the best path forward. If you want to do it though, and there's an opportunity and a legal claim there, let's go for it. But also there may be better options with local ordinances or advocating for changes in rulemaking. Yeah, I am over, and I would love to hear questions. I'm sure you all would as well. I really thank you for your time and for the return.
So thanks to all the panelists. So if you have cards, I'll take them up. And anybody want to start out just with a raised hand?
This is both for Adam and I'm sorry, you're the middle person's name, but yes, sorry, Ellen. There's quite a bit of work where they've tried to make state regulations superseding local ordinances. So what is your experience in terms of actually getting local ordinances that can actually have teeth versus, the state superseding that? So just if you can ask about that. And then Emily, if you could just talk a little bit about the economics of data centers as you understand it with respect to how they get paid relative to it, because you're saying that mostly all these folks are using natural gas, and natural gas is highly volatile in terms of pricing. So I'm just concerned about how, if you're not using renewable energy for a data center, you're subject to enormous volatility that could actually kill your economics. So I'm just wondering whether you've looked at that to any degree.
Yeah, I'll start. So really great question. I briefly cited, I believe on the third slide, the livestock facility siting law, which was a law passed in the early 2000s that looked to strip local governments of authority and autonomy to regulate industrial agriculture. One of the really interesting things that, as we've seen the growth of operations in the western portion of the state, is this idea of differentiating from that ordinance in particular. That, the argument is that's about the location of operations, which means the actual operating of the operations is something that is still regulatable. It is an unlitigated issue, and certainly every time a local government is considering it, we're seeing industry send threatening letters of litigation to those local governments. Those have had some amounts of success in just curbing any enthusiasm at the local level or any interest by the boards to actually take the next step. A few years ago, when a county board was considering a moratorium for CAFOs, just a one-year moratorium, a couple industry groups sent a letter saying that if they voted in favor of that moratorium, all of the members of the county board could be subject to felony charges. It's facially absurd, but it is really persuasive to folks that are just volunteering their time and don't always have a lawyer on speed dial to tell them what the law is. More recently, we've seen some proposals at the legislature that you could infer maybe are trying to further strip that operations ordinance autonomy. There's been a lot of really good local like organizing. A couple of statewide groups that work with local groups across the state have really pushed to make sure legislators are aware of the need of operations ordinances and prevent that from going forward. But right now, the most important work related to getting around that preemption language in some of the current state statutes has been differentiating and saying, well, if you're going to take this away, we'll do this instead.
All right, to address the money side of things with data centers, there is an aspect that I think Brittany would be able to speak better on, specifically around the fossil fuel side of things. But specifically with, I think in this case of Beaver Dam, it became very clear that the energy companies are part of this. I don't want to say conspiracy theory, but it's kind of, it's not even a theory, I would say. Because they are the ones who bought the land first.
It's cabal.
Bought the land first, and Beaver Dam City Council specifically publicly said that the build out of data centers has been part of Alliant Energy's business plan for years. And I've heard the Alliant Energy data center lead guy talk about this very thing. And then in Beaver Dam, they sold the land directly to Meta. And so that's how this is something that is happening regionally. I can't speak specifically to the other data centers that are happening across the country, but yeah, that's the conspiracy in terms of the land sale. And then of course, Alliant has a ownership share of the American Transmission Corporation company, ATC, which is the company that is building the high voltage transmission lines specifically for the data center. So there's millions of dollars coming in from the sale of the land to the build out of the energy infrastructure to the sale of that energy continuously. So they're profiting at every step of the way. And in terms of how Meta will be benefiting from these types of deals with small towns like Beaver Dam, it has a lot to do with tax breaks. Usually small towns, I can speak mostly to Beaver Dam, they put these huge developments into specific tax districts called TIDs. Yeah, I'm hitting more than one question at once. And pretty much the specifics of a TID it's specific for each contract and each agreement. But pretty much in the case of Beaver Dam, we're not, the city council or the city tax bucket will not see a single cent from this data center until 2046. And I think a lot of the organizers in the town and around the state are seeing these types of agreements and have a consensus that small city councils are in way over their heads when trillion-dollar companies are coming in with all their lawyers and their, no offense. That's hilarious. Coming in with these resources to convince small towns that this would benefit the community. But I don't think that they are fully aware of the consequences of what they're voting for. And so that's part of the push locally in all of these hyper-local efforts across the state, is to try to educate the literal one-on-one education of city council members of what are you agreeing to, what are the financials that you're agreeing to, because when it comes down to it, it's the conversation about financials and taxes and that monetary benefit to the community that actually pushes these decisions in the city council voting sessions. And I don't think I answered your question about fossil fuels. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So related to like, why do they keep investing in an energy source that's more volatile? It's because the way the system is, that the more our utilities spend, the more they make. And who pays for it? It's us. So all like operations and infrastructure, because we said solar is the cheapest. Why aren't they building out cheapest? Well, because they get
reimbursed for all the projects. The more they spend, the more they build, the more they make, and then their shareholders are guaranteed 10%, nearly 10% return on investment through the predicted lifetime of the project. It can even if it's not going, it's the predicted lifetime. So it's the way the system incentivizes and insulates, they're profit driven. And then related to this has been their long-term plan, right? Their fourth quarter financials aligned, record breaking. Projections continue to go up because of data centers.
I think it was something like 90% of their revenue increase was directly tied to data center infrastructure. So something crazy like that, yeah.
Brittany, do you have another question?
I do. I have a question about air quality. What substances are you monitoring? And so in Beloit, we use purple air monitors. We're looking at PM 2.5. So those are community level. That's not regulatory monitor. We have an ozone monitor west side of town. I have an issue of where they located it and thoughts on reasons why. It really misses most of the sources. And so we have ongoing PM 2.5 monitors there and are expanding the community network. But we have been working with the DNR trying to get a regulatory monitor in Beloit for over 2 years. And with where the DNR is financially, staff-wise, and how their culture has been shifted, it's really not in the books until there's a massive shift or change. And then how do we get involved? Yes. Well, Healthy Climate Wisconsin has a table out there. Please come see us. There's lots of opportunities. And there's lots of organizations you can be part of. And so we'd love to have you join us because we have different groups that are working on pressing for, again, these system level changes that are needed, and would love to advocate beside you. And I want to just say, like, don't wait till it's in your backyard. Right? Rock County is Dane County's carbon offset. And all these fights are everybody's, so.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, everybody. We have one last question, and then we're going to get people to do their evaluations, which go up here, and then we're going to have a small reception back in the classrooms. But
thank you all three. It's been fascinating. I guess my question is, we've seen a lot of coal-fired plants closing, and now we're seeing gas-fired plants saying they're needed. The first question is part of the reason the gas plants are needed because the coal plants were maybe retired and they were still needed? Or is it because of the demand, the AI that was not anticipated when those coal-fired plants were allowed to be closed? The second part of my question is there a comparison of the health benefit or health damages between a coal-fired plant and a methane or gas-fired plant for the same amount of energy being generated?
So I'll start with the second one. Like, there's no doubt coal is worse, right? But we have science that gas is bad. So when we have clean energy solutions that are affordable, faster to deploy, without the health funds, it's like, why aren't we doing it? And it really comes down to the financial system incentivizes burning or continuing investments in fossil fuels. And so when you asked about actually coal plants closure dates have been delayed, and really it's under by our utilities because there's no real mechanism the Public Service Commission or others has to hold the utilities to their promises, right? And these delays are tied, I believe, to with some of the data center increased demand. And then we're also seeing continued investment in the fossil fuels. Oak Creek in Paris, that was largely justified due to data center development and increased demand. So we're seeing, and I just want to highlight that, like, as the way it is, we can't have a healthy environment and these hyperscale data centers too. We have some politicians that are going and saying we can't. It's kind of like a unicorn. Like, we wish it was real, but it's not, right? It's really walking us all backwards with our climate goals, with the amount of gas plants, fossil fuels being burned. And I will say, Beloit's big gas plant that we had that was built out, we were promised Sheboygan would have their coal plant closed in 2022. It's 2026. They've delayed it like 3 or 4 times and now it's not until 2028. So when they say like our community was necessary to sacrifice for their climate goals, nothing holds them. It's really, they've had their cake, their coal plants, their gas plants and their profits, and they're just capitalizing on everything.
Wow, thank you, Brittany. Great way to end and more importantly, thank you to all of you for being here today, spending time with us. We hope you join us for a networking reception. And thank you to our speakers who were absolutely outstanding. Let's hear one more round of applause for all our speakers. Thank you. We set out to talk to you about the connection between health and the environment, and they did that in spades. All right, so don't forget your evaluations, please. Just put them in a basket here or give them to me, either way is fine, and please join us. And if you can help us clean up a little bit, that would be great. Clean up your stuff at the table and take the cups to the back. That would be amazing. Thank you so much for coming.